Welcome back to the swamp, my friends. Today is an extra special episode. This episode is going to be one of the longest ones we've done in quite some time. It's going to be a compilation of over 25 of my favorite and your favorite middle of nowhere, deep woods, and in the woods horror stories that we have covered in the last few months. If you have a story that you would like to share here in the swamp, no matter if it's a story from the woods, the middle of nowhere, or anywhere in between, be sure to submit it at swampdweller.net or the email you can find in the description down below. You can also submit it on Reddit at r/thedarkswamp. There is Something Wrong with Anastasia State Park by Soraya G. I was feeling adventurous and decided to explore the Anastasia State Park independently. I had heard it was beautiful, with stunning ocean views and dense forests. The day was perfect for an outdoor adventurer like myself, with the sun shining and a gentle breeze blowing. However, as I began my journey, I noticed how quiet it really was around me. The only sounds I could hear were the rustling of leaves under my feet and the occasional bird making some sort of chirping sound. I walked for a couple of hours, taking in the breathtaking scenery around me. But as the sun started to set, I realized I had lost track of time and honestly had no idea where I had ended up. I tried to retrace my steps as best as I could, but every direction I turned seemingly looked the same. I started to feel anxious and got a bit scared. The forest had become dark and the silence had been peaceful earlier, but now it almost seemed deafening. The rustling of leaves now sounded like footsteps behind me. I tried my best to stay calm. I tried to call out for help, but my voice echoed through the trees without any response. Then, the forest darkness started to play tricks on my mind, and I could swear I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. My heart was racing, and I started to run, hoping to find my way back to civilization. But as I ran, the forest only seemed to get darker and more ominous. I could hear strange noises and whispers, but couldn't quite make out what they were saying. I stumbled upon an abandoned cabin after some time, and my relief was only short-lived as I noticed the door was slightly ajar. As I pushed the door open, the smell of decay filled my nostrils. I could see that the cabin had not been inhabited for quite some years, but I noticed fresh blood on the walls. I knew I had to leave, and I had to get out of there fast. I ran out of that cabin and into the darkness of the forest once more. I could hear the footsteps behind me again, and I knew that I was being pursued. I tripped and fell, and as I looked up, I saw the shadowy figure looming over me. The last thing I remember was the sound of my screams echoing through the forest as I was dragged away into the darkness. I woke up quite some hours later. I couldn't tell you how long it was, disoriented and completely confused in the woods and with no memory of how I got there or what happened. To this day, I have never returned to Anastasia State Park, and I don't think I ever will. It took me quite a few hours to finally figure out where I was during the daytime hours, and luckily, I was able to follow a trail of smoke from a local campfire, so eventually I did find help. I will never, ever return to that area though. The memory, it still haunts me at night, and I've learned to never underestimate the dangers of exploring unknown territories alone. But I really don't know what happened to me that night. Whatever that shadow was, I don't know. Do not primitive camp in this state park by Bagged Carpet 1313. I have always loved the great outdoors, so when I heard about the Amica Lola Falls State Park, I knew I had to go. I packed my backpack with all the necessary camping gear and set off on my adventure. The park was vast and absolutely beautiful, with brushes of lush greenery and towering trees that seemed to touch the sky. As I hiked more profoundly into the park, I felt a sense of calm and tranquility come over me. The only sounds I could really hear were the rustling of leaves, birds chirping, and my own heartbeat. I genuinely felt at peace with nature and forgot all about my worries momentarily. Then, the sunset began to go down and I realized I still needed to set up camp. So I found a spot near a small creek, pitched my tent, and created a little fire. I sat by the fire enjoying the warmth and cooked myself a small dinner of canned soup. As the nighttime fell and the woods around me became darker and more ominous, the silence that had been peaceful earlier now seemed to be almost deafening and overpowering. The wind started to pick up, and the trees began to creak as if they were whispering secrets to each other. It was honestly some of the creepiest things I've ever heard, and I spent a lot of times out in the woods. I tried my absolute best to ignore the strange sense of unease creeping up on me. I settled into my tent, and I began to read a book for some time, trying to calm my nerves in any way as I could. But as the hours passed, I realized that I couldn't shake off that feeling that I was being watched by something or someone. I heard strange noises outside my tent, and my heart began to race. I began to hear footsteps approaching me, and I suddenly knew I wasn't alone. Now, I wouldn't have been that concerned if it were, multiple footsteps at a time, like a bear or an elk or whatever else might be out here, But the fact of the matter is, these were bipedal, and they sounded very deliberate, like they knew exactly where I was and they were coming straight toward me. I honestly tried to stay calm, and reasoned with myself that it could have just been an animal or just another hiker. But the fear was overwhelming, and it was dark by this point. I peeked through the opening of my tent, and a shadowy, tall figure was lurking in the darkness, hunched over. I couldn't determine who or what it was, but I knew it wasn't human after some time. The figure seemed to be getting closer and closer very slowly, and I felt like I was being trapped. I tried my best to scream out, but it was almost like my voice got caught in my throat. This figure lunged towards me, and I suddenly blacked out. But again, when I woke up, it was morning and the sun was shining brightly. I couldn't remember what had even happened the night before, and I felt like I had a massive migraine. But I knew something wasn't right. As I started packing my tent, I had noticed my gear had been ransacked. Some items were missing, but I needed help remembering what they were. I hiked back to civilization, feeling shaken and scared, and I just couldn't shake off that something massively terrible happened. Obviously, after some time, I began slowly remembering everything that went on and that creature. But why didn't it kill me? Why did I just black out? And why did it seemingly just steal things from me? The ranger that I eventually walked up to and told about this was very skeptical and brushed it off as a bear attack, but I knew it was much more sinister. To this day, I still can't really fully explain what happened to me that night. I don't even know if it was a wild animal or something supernatural. But one thing is for sure, I'll never go back to Amica Lola Falls State Park ever again, and you're damn sure I will always go camping with a freaking firearm. Goatman Spared My Life by Anonymous. I honestly used to love to go jogging in my local state park. It was a great way to get in exercise, enjoy nature, and clear my head all at once. But one day, things took a very terrifying turn. I set off on my usual route, enjoying the peak's peacefulness. The sun was shining, and there was a light breeze in the air. It was a perfect day for a jog. I had gone about a mile in when I heard something rustling in the bushes. At first, I thought it was just an animal, but as I got closer, I saw a figure moving in the trees. It was tall, with long, thin arms and legs covered in what looked like matted fur. It had a snout-like face with piercing red eyes that seemed to glow in the sunlight. I froze, not really knowing what to do. The creature started to move toward me, and I could hear its hooves pounding on the ground. I let out a blood-curdling scream, and I knew I had to run like my life depended on it. I took off as fast as I could, but the creature was fast and was catching up to me. I could hear its ragged breathing and felt its hot breath on my neck at one point. I turned around to face it, but it was far too late. The creature had begun to tackle me to the ground. I tried to fight it off, but it was far too strong. Its long, sharp claws dug into my skin, and I could feel its hot breath on my face. I let out a scream of pain, and I knew I was probably going to die here. As I began to lay on the ground, helpless, the goat-man creature towering over me, its razor-sharp claws inches from my face, its snout-like nose twitched as it sniffed me, its red eyes boring into mine. I could smell the stench of its breath, a mix of rotting meat and decaying vegetation. Its fur was matted and greasy, covered in dirt and leaves. I could feel the heat radiating from its body and the weight of it pressing down on me. I struggled to break free, but the goatman creature was just far too strong. It uttered a piercing scream, and I knew it was over. I just resigned myself there, closed my eyes, and waited for the final blow. But, out of nowhere, something really strange happened. The goatman creature suddenly stopped attacking me and just took off into the trees, vanishing right then and there. I honestly laid there for who knows how long, confused and absolutely terrified. Not knowing what to do, after a few moments, I managed to finally pull myself together, get to my feet, and started my best to run towards the entrance. My heart was pounding, my legs felt like lead, and I didn't stop until I was finally out of that dreaded park. Luckily, my wounds seemed to be more superficial than anything. When I got home, I was in shock. I couldn't believe what the heck had just happened to me. I spent the rest of the night pacing back and forth in my room, trying to make sense of it all. I didn't know if I should tell my parents, who to tell, who would believe me. The next day, I went to the library to research goat-man-type creatures, and I discovered there were legendary creatures, half-human, half-goat, originating in Greek mythology. There were stories of goat-man animals throughout history with sightings worldwide, even in Texas, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, all over. But I knew what I had seen was real and was no mere myth. The goat-man creature in the park had terrifyingly been real. I tried to warn the park authorities, but they thought I was just playing a prank. They told me it was probably a wild animal, some sort of dog or something, and I was lucky to have escaped. But I knew the truth. The goat-man creature was still out there, waiting for his next victim. Maybe he wouldn't be so sparing to the next. I never returned to that park again, and I warned everyone that I knew to stay away. The beast is still lurking in the shadows, waiting for the perfect opportunity to strike again. I just know it. Why I Quit My Job as a Park Ranger by Turbo Baker 67. I've been a park ranger for over 15 years, and I've seen some pretty strange things in my time. But nothing could have prepared me for what I saw that night in the state park. It was late, and I was making my rounds, checking the various campsites and hiking trails. That's when I stumbled upon the remains of a dead bear. It looked like it had been mauled by something much bigger and more powerful. I took a few pictures to document the scene and send it to the higher-ups for investigation. The last thing we needed was a giant cannibal bear around. As I was about to leave the area, something caught my eye. A shadowy figure moving in the trees nearby, just out of my line of sight. I figured it had to be some deer or something like that, so I approached slowly, trying not to startle it. But as I got closer, I realized this indeed was no deer. It was something much more grotesque. It had the body of a man, but the face of a bear. Its eyes glowed a bright red, and its teeth were long and sharp. It was covered in thick, matted fur and smelled like death. I froze in terror as the creature began to growl and snarl. I knew I had to leave, but my legs just wouldn't carry me away. It was like they were rooted to that spot. That's when the creature charged at me. I tried to run, but it was far too fast. It tackled me to the ground, and I felt its hot breath on my face. I thought I was going to die right then and there, but as fast as it had attacked me, it ran into the woods, leaving me shaken and scared. I don't know why. As I tried to collect myself and the radio for backup, I couldn't help but feel like something was watching me. Like this thing wasn't actually gone, you know? The feeling of being followed just never left me, even as I drove away from that state park. I tried to shake it off as just my nerves, but something about the encounter with that creature had left a deep mark on me. Over the next few days, I dug into the park's history to find any records of strange sightings or reports of animals acting oddly. That's when I stumbled upon an old newspaper article from the mid-1950s. It talked about a group of loggers who had gone missing in the woods, never to be seen again. The article described how some loggers had reported seeing some strange creatures with a man's body and a bear's face in the woods before disappearing. I couldn't even believe what I was reading. Was it possible that the creature I had encountered was the same thing that had been reported all those years ago? Or maybe it was just one of his children or something. I knew I had to investigate further to figure this out. So I did return to that area where I had seen the creature, armed with a camera and a flashlight. I searched the woods for hours to find evidence of its existence. That's when I stumbled upon a cave. It was hidden behind a large boulder. I would have missed it if I hadn't paid more attention. I cautiously approached the cave, shining my flashlight inside. What I saw made my blood run cold. The cave was littered with bones, some of them clearly human. The air was thick with the stench of death, and I could hear something breathing deep within the darkness. I knew I had to get out of there before this thing would get me and not spare me like it did before. As I turned to leave, I swear I just had this feeling of being watched all over again. As I began to turn to leave, something grabbed my ankle. I fell to the ground and my flashlight flew out of my hand. I could feel something trying to pull me back into the cave, dragging me towards the darkness. I fought with all my strength, kicking and screaming, and eventually I was able to break free and run from the cave. The only thing I lost in that process was one of my hiking boots. I stumbled into the daylight, gasping for air. I never turned back, I never looked back, and I never even went back to that state park. I quit right then and there on the spot, and I left. And I forever will feel this deep dread. I was just lucky enough to make it out alive. Twice. To this day, I still wonder what that creature is, whether it's still out there in the woods waiting for its next victim, and where it even came from. To get this story started, here is a bit of background information about myself. I am a female, 17 years of age. I'm very petite, weighing about 100 pounds and standing at just 5'3". I recently joined my local gym around January 2019 and have started a routine of when I work out every day, except for Monday, sometime around 6 p.m. usually, and usually I'll stay for about an hour or two depending on the day and how I feel. Anyone who goes to the gym regularly notices others around them and gets familiar with what times and machines are usually available. And if a new person comes, you usually notice them. My point is that you get used to these people in the gym with you, whether or not you communicate with them. As a girl who goes to the gym, from my experience, you will get the occasional glance from a weirdo or make awkward eye contact with someone staring at you in the mirror. But all you can do is stare back at them dead in the eyes and give them the nastiest look of disgust. Now, the time that I go to the gym is when everyone usually starts to leave. I am very antisocial and shy, so this works out great for me. Or so I had thought, having some alone time would be excellent. And if something were to happen, they would have cameras everywhere. Now I know this is a stupid way to think, but knowing that you had to have a key card to get into the gym and one to get out was a comfort along with the cameras. For this past month of me doing my workouts, I got this weird vibe from this random guy we will call Randy. As I said, you usually get people looking at you, so it is hard to tell if someone is genuinely a significant threat or just someone being a creep. Either way, both are usually bad, but it's difficult to distinguish the two. I told my mom about this Randy guy because my gut feeling told me something was just wrong and I felt like I needed some advice. She told me we should tell the manager and have them kick him out. But being naive and friendly, I didn't want to kick a guy out just for giving me the creeps. It wasn't a good argument at the time. I started to notice some of the other girls weren't coming as regularly as they would. I brushed this off thinking they had work or were out of town or something. It was really none of my business, but it was something to note. The staff of the gym leaves around 6:30 p.m., and I noticed that Randy was coming in almost precisely when the manager and staff would leave. Again, I didn't really pay too much attention to this because he could have just been a regular person trying to work out at a specific time due to his job or whatever was going on in his life. This was a huge mistake on my end. Here is me trying to reason with myself and rationalize that nothing was going on because I constantly saw Randy. So I considered him one of the regulars, I guess. But this is where the story actually begins. I went to do my daily workout and the manager, let's call her Alyssa, came up and talked to me about other girls who worked out at the same time I did. These girls were complaining about Randy secretly recording them while they worked out. The girls changed their workout schedule due to Randy, which explains why I saw fewer and fewer of them. She asked me if I had seen any men holding their phone up to their chest and walking with the camera pointed outwards. I said no, until I told Alyssa about this random man Randy, who was starting to creep me out. She said she would look into it and update me on the situation, mainly since I'm underage. The next day, Alyssa talked to me. She said that one of the girls who complained about him pointed him out on the cameras and that she would wait for Randy to come back into the gym, kick him out, and trespass him if he ever came back. She left that night not knowing what had happened because Alyssa was still waiting after I left. I returned to the gym that following Tuesday and Alyssa told me everything that had gone down. She had said that she waited till Randy and his buddy, who we will call Kyle, came to the gym and were parked outside. Alyssa had a friend who was a sheriff. Apparently, he rang up Randy's license plates, and to both of their surprises, he was a registered sex offender and had put on probation recently. Alyssa then found out that Randy didn't even have a key card, meaning he was not a member of the gym and shouldn't have been using the gym, period. His friend Kyle had a key card and was letting Randy in. They would work out sometimes and wait for the staff to leave and do creepy things. Alyssa prohibited both of the men entering the gym again and kicked them out. The scary thing is that I remember being alone in that gym with those two guys very often. They blended in very well, and I considered them just average workout people. I'm still not sure if Randy or Kyle recorded me, but Alyssa told me she was going to look through the footage and let me know any other news she could, such as them recording me and all that. It is terrifying to think that I got accustomed to these guys regularly being at the gym. I am so thankful that Alyssa kept me informed on the situation. As terrifying as it is, it shows that you should always be aware of what's happening around you and to trust your instincts. It also shows that you never can trust anyone you think you might know. As stupid as it sounds, it's easy to get comfortable with people we see daily even if we don't know who they are. But who knows what might have happened if I caught Randy and Kyle alone again. Please be careful at all times. Never judge anyone for good or bad until you actually know them. You never know what might be out there to hurt you. Thank you for your time in reading the story. Every Barbie Has Her Ken by J. Beardify. At my college, Halloween is the social event of the year. As soon as the leaves start to change, the campus comes alive. Art students gather in the quad to design and assemble homemade costumes. Sororities hold pumpkin carving competitions and fraternities compete to throw the wildest, freakiest parties imaginable. 2 years ago, Kappa Alpha hired costume actors to hide inside the closets and hide behind the shower curtains of the party to give people jump scares. But they lost the informal competition to one of the other medical fraternities who'd stolen a real John Doe corpse from the autopsy lab and put it in their bathtub full of ice and drinks. They got in a lot of trouble for that one. Everyone was always trying to outdo each other. I guess it's no surprise that Halloween here has a dark side as well. Those jump scare actors hiding in the Kappa Alpha house, they weren't all actors. One was a guy that just came off the street, slipped on a costume, and tried to drag a girl from the party into the abandoned basement. But some of the guys fought him off. He was never caught. Oh, and the corpse at that medical fraternity party? The morning after, they found someone had bitten pieces off of it. Last year, my buddy Matt was in charge of organizing our frat's Halloween party. He's a buff, blonde, handsome guy with a good sense of humor. So, one of us jokingly suggested his costume should be Ken from the Barbie franchise. And he went with it. Matt even started walking around campus in costume the week before Halloween, trying to drum up interest in our party. I noticed, though, he had started looking worn and haggard. I asked him what was going wrong.
"You wouldn't even believe me if I told you,"
was his tired response. As it turned out, he didn't have to. A few nights later, as we were unloading crates of fake spider webs to decorate the frat house, I saw her for the first time. The woman was dressed in all pink and freakishly exaggerated makeup and big blonde hair. She was coming towards us along the sidewalk and she was moving like a doll. "Matt, there's..." The woman just stopped beneath a streetlight, staring at my friend. But when I finally got him to turn around, the bulb flickered and she was gone. The next day I saw her again, or another woman just like her, walking through the hallway between classes. Her proportions were all wrong, if like a Barbie doll had become human. Her wrists and ankles were way too thin, her chest and hips too big. I felt sick thinking of how a person could have mutilated their body to get in such a shape like that, but on her face was a perfect plastic smile. As she passed by, she ran her freakishly long pink fingernails through Matt's hair, "See you at the party, Ken, baby," she whispered. I turned to say something, but she had already turned around and been carried away by the crowd. Matt shuddered. "That is the wrong Barbie. I see her everywhere. The other day, while I was on the toilet, someone came into the bathroom in hot pink heels. She stood right outside of the stall door, whispering, 'Ken, baby, don't you want to come out and play?' By the time I got up, she was gone. One of the sororities must be screwing with me. That's gotta be it, right?" I wasn't so sure. Maybe it was just her tanning bed baked, wrinkly skin, but Matt's Barbie looked too old to still be in college. I guess I shouldn't have been surprised to see her at the fraternity party. Matt's Barbie was bringing him a pair of drinks, one for him and one for her. She floated through the crowd of students like a blonde cloud in hot pink heels, wearing that big fake smile. Now that I was closer to her, I realized she couldn't have made any other expression. It was like her face had been plastic surgery to only make that smile, forever. Just like a doll's, she didn't speak to anyone except Matt, and she called him Ken all night. She whispered to him in a cutesy but also really creepy babying voice that made her face seem even more like a plastic mask. I was worried about my friend. I went through all 3 floors of the house asking if anyone knew the woman in the Barbie outfit, but nobody did. I figured it was time to tell Matt to throw her out, but when I went back downstairs, Barbie was sitting on Matt's lap and he had a boozy, contented smile on his face. Everyone else obviously uncomfortable around this weirdly proportioned stranger, but it was Matt's party. If he wanted to make out with an older woman with a thing for Barbie, who the hell were we to deny him? I didn't see Matt again until I was getting some vodka out of the ice-filled bathtub a few hours later. He came stumbling in, grabbed the sides of the toilet, and puked up an awful-smelling hot pink liquid. "Bitch," he snarled. "She put something in my drink. She's out of here." He staggered woozily back into the crowd. I breathed a sigh of relief. Barbie was giving me creeps. I'd be glad to see her gone, honestly. But wait, Matt was drugged. Could he really handle her on his own? I pushed my way through the costumed crowd. No Matt. I started to panic and ran out front. Barbie had her hands under Matt's armpits. She was dragging him towards the open back door of some sort of white van. I must have screamed because a bunch of guys came running. When we surrounded her, she pulled a needle of I don't even know how to explain it. It was some sort of substance inside. "Which one of you Ken boys wants to find out what's in the needle, She hissed at us in that weird baby voice. We put our hands up and backed off, but the distraction gave Matt time to tear himself out of the grasp of her freakishly long nails. Still jabbing the needle in our direction, Barbie got into the driver's seat and burnt rubber. I scrambled to read the license plate as the van's taillights disappeared into the chilly Halloween night. We stood there in silence for quite a few minutes, panting, too stunned by what we had just seen to say freaking anything. Matt puked up another puddle of that acidic pink stuff, and we knew we had to get him to the hospital. It was an unspoken rule at our college that we never went to the police about any shenanigans that we got up to on Halloween. But this was different. Matt had been drugged. The license plate number of the white van had found it to be stolen. They traced it to an abandoned, foreclosed house in a rundown suburb on the edge of town, and what they discovered in the basement confirmed our story. Both of the young men found in the abandoned house had been the same age, body type, and hair color as Matt. Their corpses had even been dressed in matching Ken costumes. Our Barbie had apparently been doing amateur plastic surgery on their faces and bodies, trying to make them perfect, trying to make them like her. Of course, there was no anesthesia, and losing so much blood is always fatal. I'm sure that if we wouldn't have stopped the woman in pink, the same thing would have happened to Matt. What scares me the most, however, is that our Barbie is still out there, cruising Halloween parties, looking for her next Ken. Delivery Driver by E.B. Davis. I'm a delivery driver. Sometimes I wake up not remembering where I am. Yeah, it's not the usual sort of delivery job. Take this morning, for instance. Right now, I've just polished off an omelet and I am finishing off my coffee before hitting the road. About an hour ago, I woke up in a room in a Motel 6 across the street. It had been uncomfortably warm, the failing air conditioning still chugging away, and I had woken with a nasty headache, the result of a poor night's sleep. Other than that, I had no idea where I was. It was the heat that I remembered first, if you consider it a memory and not something that never went away. I had checked in at about 7 the previous evening. It was a hot summer day, western exposure, and the poor air conditioner never even had a chance. But if I would have known that this air conditioning would fail so badly, I would have asked for a different room or gone somewhere else. I'm not very picky, I just like to not be hot. I pulled the double curtain open just a bit to notice my view of Interstate 5 real up close. Oh, that's right, I was in Redding, Northern California. With that keystone in place, the rest of my memory popped back into place rather well. Yesterday, I had woken up in Eugene, Oregon, made stops in Florence, Eureka, Cave Junction, Weed, and finally Redding before stopping for the night. The day before that, I had woken in Vancouver, British Columbia, with stops in Bellingham, Edison, Elma, Aberdeen, and Astoria before making my way south to Eugene. Today, I had stops to make in Zamora, Livermore, Castroville, and Grapevine. Not sure yet where I'll stop tomorrow. Haven't checked my list yet, but it doesn't really matter much. I suppose my memory's pretty decent when I've got a reference to start from. Maybe that's part of why I was picked for this job. Like I said, it's not the usual sort. I drive most of the day and stop somewhere, usually somebody's house or apartment. I drop off a package, often I'll pick up a new one from the same customer and then drive on to the next. I've got a list, a few weeks worth, updated regularly. I've only met my employer, or I suppose I should say my fellow employee of our employer once, when I was hired. It was strange. First, they recruited me, right out of the blue, a total cold call. Second, I didn't even think having a PhD was a usual criteria for delivery drivers, you know? Since then, I've only communicated by email or phone, and rarely that. I hadn't expected to accept the offer when I showed up at the little commercial office. The pay was unsustainably generous. I drive a company car they've paid for, though they let me pick it out. I suggested a Mercedes S-Class as a joke, but they didn't hesitate. They gave me a card for food and gas expenses, also hotels. Understand that I don't always sleep in cheap, crummy, sleazy hotels. I'll often stop at a swaggy 4-star resort. It's just that sometimes you just want to get off the road and put your feet up. Even the cheap rooms usually offer a basic standard of quality, and when you're on the road all day every day, the bad rooms and the good rooms tend to just blur together. That's why sometimes I just don't remember where I am. Food, hotels, entertainment, really I have a lot of leeway in how I want to go about my day. Even on the weekends and holidays, I can still use the card. The only thing I need to concern myself with are the few simple aspects of the job. I knock on a stranger's door. I give them the package I've been carrying or they give me a new one. The package is of reasonable proportions, never too big or heavy or unwieldy, very nondescript. I place that package in the trunk of my car, always the trunk, drive to the drop-off, and repeat. I'm to drive carefully and responsibly, which I'd always do anyway, and I'm not to drink or take drugs while driving, or, for that matter, drive while tired or texting, which I'd never do anyway. Minor speeding is not really much of an issue. 5 or 10 over the speed limit on a freeway is not a big deal. If there's any kind of delay, that's not my fault. Unexpected road closures, mechanical trouble, major incidents, inclement weather, it's not really a problem. I just need to phone it in and the company will take care of it. Contact the customers and I can continue on when possible. I'm to not draw attention to myself. If I'm pulled over, I'm to act responsibly and respectfully. And if I receive a ticket, the company will pay the fine. Several years in and I've never had a problem. I am absolutely not to give a police officer any probable cause to search the trunk or the package therein. If a police officer does search, I am to, at the immediate earliest opportunity, call the number the company had me memorize and their legal department will take care of the situation. Afterwards, my position will be terminated and I will be giving a generous severance package. The contract makes it very clear that the company is totally liable for any contents of the package, and I am simply a courier, ignorant of the package's contents. I am never to investigate the contents of the package. If I attempt to, my position will be immediately terminated without any severance package. The contract makes it clear that this is how I personally remain unliable for any of the contents. What my contract doesn't say, but I can only guess, is that this is the reason for my exorbitant salary. I suppose maybe there are filthy rich people out there who will pay large sums of money to have various private but perfectly legal items delivered discreetly. I honestly don't think that's the case though for many of these. First, most of the rich people I've met are pretty stingy and would ship something highly valuable by UPS, ground service if they could save a few bucks. Second, I'm pretty sure our customers aren't rich. I meet them personally at their doors. The stop in Elma the other day was at a freaking trailer park. So naturally, my speculation, and for legal purposes, I'll repeat, this is only speculation, was that maybe these packages have illegal contents. I used to spend a lot of time thinking and worrying about what sort of illegal content it could be. I don't think it's drugs. They have their own system of mules for that, right? Maybe that's only on TV, I don't know. Of all the things it could be though, the two possibilities that cost me the most consternation were smuggling or fencing in some kind of valuable commodity, like jewels or works of art. The only other thing that's related that kinda had me nervous was smuggling priceless antiquities. I've read articles about how that's a very lucrative trade, how it's a very small and organized community, and very, very rich. I still don't know what the deal is with the customers though, or maybe that's just some sort of front. There was also something kind of exciting about being involved with illicit antiquities trades. Like I was a minor bad guy out of an Indiana Jones movie. Now don't get me wrong, I don't support the trade and would prefer those things find their way to museums. I was only ever speculating about that anyway, usually to keep my mind occupied during the more boring parts of the drive. There are other illegal things I'd very much not want to be transporting on a more moral level. I know better now, and besides, they were paying me specifically not to know what was in the packages I was delivering. And boy do they pay. The thing is, I'm hardly ever at home. I paid off my mortgage the first year. The only expenses I really pay are property taxes, housekeeping services, insurance, and utilities. That means the paychecks just keep stacking up in my account. I thought about investing in stocks or something. I mean, if you've got money, you can leverage it to make more money. But I'm in no rush. I don't think I'll be needing to invest. I have no concern about making more money than I've already got. In fact, it's piling up so fast that I thought I might start buying up more houses. Not as real estate investment, not at first. The idea was I'd buy a house in different parts of the country, and if I were in the state on a weekend trip or something, I could stay at that house while I was out on my route, just for the comfort of it. I'd also be something like a security blanket. If I ever did quit or lose this job and didn't want to travel anymore, I could pick my favorite place to live and sell the other houses, which would most certainly appreciate faster than the rest of my savings account interest ever could. So that's why I'm perfectly content with being a delivery driver. You know what? I enjoyed the driving too. It's a nice perk. You might think long distance driving all day must be a terrible bore that wears you out. And that's partly true, I won't lie. But in my opinion, the sights I've seen make it all worth it. I get off the main freeway a lot too, so it's not like it's just long distance trips you're trying to finish as fast as possible. I see grand sights. The Columbia River Gorge at sunset in autumn, and the Grand Tetons at dawn. The New York skyline from all the bridges, the lights of LA at night from the Hollywood Hills, and so on. It's the subtle stuff, though, that makes your heart ache. I remember a curving, winding road going over rolling hills in Nebraska with pretty little farmhouses around each bend. An old barn in Vermont with the fog growing in sheets on the low ground at dusk. The view from a recently plowed road in the high Cascades where the peaks surrounding you were covered in such fresh snow that it looked like marshmallow fluff. A great fault block mountain rising out of the barren flatlands of eastern Oregon, so high, so wide, it generated its own rich ecosystems. A little old mining town in West Virginia where all of the buildings were so old they all had historical provenance. Not because they're preserved by historical societies, but because they've been well used and maintained by the people that love them. A lightning storm at night in rural Louisiana that seemed to roll on for Affinity. I thought about getting a little dashboard camera and recording my trips. I guess that's what led to it all unraveling. I'd forgotten I'd bought the thing online on a whim from a hotel room until I found it among the unusual stack of packages on a trip home. By then, I'd set the idea aside as rather pointless. I'd never find the time to edit such a video anyway, let alone watch it. The scenery I had always enjoyed was going to be a fleeting moment enjoyed spontaneously and maybe again in memory. A dash cam would never really recapture the moments. So then I started thinking about what else I could use the little camera for. I guess it was always a dumb idea. Now that I look back, I don't know why I thought of it in the first place. I had the camera, I had the car, I had the mysterious packages in the trunk. I'm not going to say I never thought about opening the packages. It was sort of like being at some kind of console at work, with a big red button, and your boss tells you that no matter what, never push the big red button. Sure, you wonder what would happen. That temptation, though, never came close to breaking my will, or at least my will to keep getting paid so well. I guess that's why I put the camera in the trunk, along with a floodlight. I could study the package without actually opening it. That's what the contract said, after all. I was supposed to keep the package in the trunk and I was not supposed to examine its contents. It never said anything about the exterior. It never said anything about not having cameras in the trunk. I know now that must have been some sort of loophole my employers had never really considered. I suppose in the future they will fill that loophole up. I only found the loophole by dumb luck. I never really used the car's navigation system. I always had a great sense of direction, and I'd go over all the directions to my destinations from the luxury of my hotel room the night before. So, the large monitor on the dash of my luxury car seldom displayed anything but the station ID of the radio channel or the title of the audiobook I was listening to. So, I ran a USB cable from it, all the way to the trunk, through the back seats to the console. The video feed showed up at the push of a button on my steering wheel. I immediately wondered why I even bothered. On the first trip I checked and it was exactly what I'd expect. A view of my trunk, 12 packs of Coke, my toolbox, and the package. All exactly as I had left it. I think I remember feeling embarrassed, so I turned off the feed. I turned it back on the next few deliveries and each time was the same. So I almost forgot I'd even bothered in the first place. It was some time later, I don't remember exactly how much, but I was on the road to Spooner, Wisconsin. I was scrolling through my media during one of those boring stretches. I came to the trunk cam feed and paused because something felt off. I'm not sure why, I just felt the little hairs on my arms raise up. It was an instinctual sort of feeling. Now that I look back, I wonder if it was the instinct that led me to put the camera in the first place. Or something else. I kept the feed on as I drove and kept glancing at the screen suspiciously. My first thought was that there was some kind of light out. It looked shadowy somehow, except that didn't make any sense. There was only one light in the trunk, the floodlight I had put on a hook on the ceiling of the trunk. It was bright as it had ever been, except in the spot by the package I was carrying. I couldn't figure it out. I kept driving and I kept my eye on it, and it kept getting darker and darker. Then I noticed the spot on the package itself. It was sort of the reverse of a light from a flashlight, a spot of darkness if you will, round and fairly distinct if not sharp, and it grew. It grew sort of like a tumor, like you might imagine a small melanoma on pale skin, getting bigger and bigger. It grew until the whole package was very dark despite the light. I kept trying to think of a reasonable explanation. Camera artifacts, digital compression, LED branding glitches, but nothing really explained it. Then it got blacker. The total absence of light, it was like a package wrapped in a black paper. It was like some kind of hole in 3 dimensions, matching perfectly the length, width, and height of the package. I felt sure if I could change the position of the camera, the hole would change with proportions of the package. I almost wanted to pull over and open the trunk to see it with my own two eyes, but now I was way too close to the delivery site, so I waited and I drove another 20 miles or so. I turned the feed off because I couldn't handle the temptation, and I quite frankly didn't want to see what the heck was going on. When I finally stopped and popped the trunk, the package looked exactly like it was supposed to. Brown paper wrapping, the kind of clear tape with the little parallel strings running through it, an address label with my company's letterhead on it. The man who signed it was an older man living in what looked like a vacation cabin on a lake. He seemed no different than any other customer. He gave me another package to deliver, this one to Minnesota. If he noticed me acting strange, he didn't let on at all. One of the more personal things about this whole experience was that I was honestly disturbed how quickly I accepted it all. I used to be a rational, logical, scientifically minded person. Now, within the span of literally an hour, I had accepted the paranormal wholesale. Everything I understood about the world was thrown out the window. I kept expecting my phone to ring, a company representative calling me to tell me about my position being terminated, but they somehow just physically knew that their cover had been blown. I had a very restless night that night in my hotel room in Minneapolis. I thought my life was in danger. I was dealing with something far beyond my mortal understanding. No one ever came, though. No one ever called. No demon teleported behind me and stole my soul. I don't think my employers even know. Like I said, I think I found a loophole they never considered. The next several deliveries did nothing unusual. Most don't. I don't think it's because of any of these packages are, normal. No, I think it's the opposite. It's just whatever's wrong with them isn't always visible. When I do see something strange, it's always different. One delivery in New Mexico started bulging outwards like it was breathing in and out for hundreds of miles. There was another package, a small one that almost bulged out, but instead of the entire surface bulging out, it was only like little dimples that would move around in certain areas. Sort of imagine like fingers or something like that trying to press out, only they moved in no pattern of a hand. There was one package that turned itself over and over, like a rectangular opaque hamster ball, but they never moved once from its original position. There was another one that floated. Whenever I braked or turned corners, it would drift in the appropriate direction, then drift back. There was one that burst into a flame. It was small at first, the same flame about the size of a lit match. It grew though, and slower than you would have expected from a paper-wrapped package. By the time half of the package had ignited, the trunk was filling with smoke. I should have been able to smell it, but somehow I just didn't. A few miles later, and it was fully engulfed. I could hardly see the flames through the smoke. In time, the camera went fully black. That was the only time I ever stopped a car to check. I opened up the trunk and the package and everything else was perfectly normal. I grabbed a Coke out of the case, just for cover, just because, I had a strange feeling I was being watched. One time, a package started to turn itself inside out. I saw bubble wrap just before I turned off the feed. I don't know if that counted as inspecting the contents of the package, but I didn't want to risk it. I never turned the feed on again until that package had been delivered. I'm not trying to be facetious or do some sort of unknowable cosmic horror thing. I literally just can't describe it, but here is my best attempt. The package flattened out like the scent of fresh strawberries. The package upwised ponderously like a green barnacle. The package integrated an overripe mirror. It's like I have explanation aphasia. I have a real conundrum here. There's a part of me that wants to quit, put in 2 weeks' notice. Thank you, it was nice working for you, then retire in some mansion on a tropical island and never worry about it again. A part of me wants to know and see through this though. I'll never have a connection to the paranormal again. How can I live with myself if I leave now without understanding? I think if I just keep going, it's all going to come to a head at some point anyway. It's starting to leak out. The supernatural. I don't know if it's just in my head or if it's a world of itself. I don't know if I am somehow being enveloped by it. As far as I know, my employers still have not noticed. Sometimes when I'm driving in the dark at night or in stormy weather, I'll see a pair of headlights, perfectly normal headlights, except there's no car behind them. They'll move around, drive like a car would. Sometimes they come in the opposite direction and they're gone in a flash. Sometimes they're in another lane, going the same direction, and then they'll be overtaking you and disappear. It's very hard to explain. I don't know what they are, and sometimes I see freeway exits that aren't supposed to be there. Exit 189 Airport Way, Exit 190 Martin Luther King Way, Exit 191 Commercial Street, Exit 828761 Tannhauser's Crypt. I haven't taken any of those exits. I keep going, and I'm getting more tempted, but I'm terrified of what I'll discover on them. There's a radio channel I've discovered, AM band. If I'm able to find it, it's usually the same frequency, wherever I am in the country. That shouldn't be possible. It's one of those evangelical channels, fire and brimstone type preachers. It's playing 24 hours a day, the same guy non-stop, no commercials. He hardly takes a breath. He likes to preach about damnation and eschatology, weird people names and places from all over from extinct languages. When he quotes Bible verses, they're usually verses that aren't actually in the Bible, at least from no canon that I know. I check in the Bibles in hotel rooms every night, and I'm pretty sure I'll start finding them someday, I guess, but not in the versions of the Bible that are provided to us. Something has to happen. I can quit the paranormal, and it will still be there. My employers can discover and close the loophole, or something else. Maybe something worse than my employers finding me will happen to me. It's all very distracting. I think that's part of the reason I don't remember where I am when I wake up. It's not always just restless sleep. I think I'll wake up in a place that doesn't really exist someday. It's like the whole world, or at least my world, is coming apart at the seams. I wonder what would happen if I installed a microphone. Isolation Isn't Always Safe by Trailer Park Boys 445. I thought living in an isolated cabin in the middle of nowhere would be a dream come true. A chance to get away from it all and enjoy the beauty of nature. But now, I know much better than that. It honestly all started on a dark and stormy night. The wind was howling, and the rain was coming down in sheets. I was sitting by the fire, enjoying the warmth, when I heard a strange noise coming from outside. At first, I thought it was just the wind. But then, I started hearing it more often, again and again, and then what sounded like a low growl that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I looked out the window, but couldn't see anything in the darkness. I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. But then I heard another noise, a scratching sound like something was trying to claw its way inside. I went to the door and peered through the peephole, but all I could see was darkness. I cracked the door, shone my flashlight outside, and there was nothing there. I was about to close the door and return to bed when I heard a loud bang like something had hit the roof. I looked up, and to my horror, I saw a pair of glowing eyes staring back at me. I slammed the door shut and locked it, but I knew this wouldn't hold whatever was out there for very long. I could hear it scratching and clawing at the door, trying to get inside desperately. The sound was so loud and terrifying that I thought the door would break at any given second. I huddled by the fire, praying for whatever was outside. I just hoped it would disappear, but it didn't. Instead, it kept scratching and clawing, and I could hear its growls getting louder and more aggressive. It felt like hours had passed, but the creature outside never gave up. I was too scared to sleep, too scared to move, and too scared to even call for help. The sun finally rose and the creature disappeared. I ventured outside and saw the roof had been damaged. The claw marks were all over the door, and I knew I couldn't stay in this cabin any longer. So I packed my things and left, never looking back. Now, whenever I hear a strange noise at night, I can't help but remember that terrifying night in that isolated cabin. A Highway of Nightmares by A.J. I was driving down an empty stretch of road in the middle of nowhere. The sun had set hours ago and the darkness was all-encompassing. The only light came from the headlights of my car, illuminating the road ahead. I had been driving for hours and the scenery had not changed very much at all. It was desolate and barren with no signs of life for miles around. For some reason though, I couldn't shake this sense of unease, as if I was not alone on this road. Suddenly, I saw something moving in the distance. I woke up instantly and my heart began to race. It was like a natural energy endorphin. It looked like it was a figure walking towards me in the middle of the road. As I got closer, I could see that it was a man dressed in tattered clothing with a wild look in his eyes. I tried to swerve around him, but he jumped in front of my car, causing me to slam on my brakes. He stood there, staring at me through the windshield, and I could see that his eyes were bloodshot and his face was twisted into a grotesque smile. I tried to back up, but my car was stuck. I was trapped, alone with this deranged man in the middle of nowhere. He started to walk towards me, his pace slow and deliberate. I could hear his breathing, ragged and heavy. I locked the doors and rolled up the windows, but I knew it was useless. He was getting closer, and I could see him now. His skin was mottled and gray, his hair unkempt and greasy. Suddenly, he lunged at my car, pounding his fist on the windows and screaming. I could hear his nails scratching against the glass, and I knew he wanted to break in. I tried to start the car, but it just wouldn't budge. I was trapped with this madman closing in on me. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, my breaths coming in short gasps. Then, just when I thought it was all over, the man, for whatever reason, stopped. He looked at me with these bloodshot eyes, then turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness. Then, only did I notice then, there was another car coming down the road. I guess I was so focused on this man I didn't notice them. I got out of my car and I instantly flagged them down. They helped me get my car turned around and eventually I drove home. But I can't tell you how it felt in that moment to feel like you were helpless. And if this car just didn't happen to be driving down the road, I would have been dead. It's honestly good that it worked out this way. But I don't know if other people in the future would be so lucky. Backcountry Voodoo Weirdness by Pickled Salmon 007. I recently heard about a new trail that promised breathtaking views, so I knew I had to check it out. But little did I know, what I would find would leave me scarred for the rest of my life. I eagerly set out on a new hiking trail that promised amazing views and beautiful scenery, but what I found was beyond anything I could have imagined. The course began innocently enough, winding through the trees and up the mountainside. But as I hiked deeper into the forest, I noticed something strange. Tied to the trees, along the trail, were animal carcasses rotting in the sun. At first, I thought it was just a few unlucky animals that had died in the wild, but then I saw more and more, all tied up with twine in the same fashion. The smell of death and decay in the air was overwhelming. It was thick and it was making me want to gag. The putrid smell is something that you can't explain unless you've been around a lot of dead animals. As I continued down the trail, the number of animal carcasses increased, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was beginning to stalk me. Every rustle of the leaves made me jump, and I could feel my heart pounding in my ears. Suddenly, I stumbled upon a clearing, and in the center stood a massive tree covered in animal carcasses. The stench was almost unbearable, and the sight was beyond disturbing. The animals hung from the tree like grotesque ornaments, rotting and decaying in the sun. I realized then that I had stumbled upon some sort of sinister, ritualistic killing ground where someone or something was sacrificing animals to some unknown god or force. Fear instantly gripped me, and I tried to back away slowly, but I swear I could feel eyes on me from every direction watching my every move. The forest was eerily silent except for the thud of my heart in my ears. I knew I needed to leave the place immediately, but my legs felt like they were made of stone. I forced myself to turn around and run back down that trail, every step taking me further and further from that nightmare. When I finally returned to the trailhead, I collapsed on the ground, gasping for air. The image of those animal carcasses tied to the trees like some twisted offering would forever be seared into my mind. The thought that someone or something was out there, watching me, hunting me, still haunts me. I reported this all to the police, but I'm not sure whatever came of it. Weird Occurrence I Had by Cayman Duelist 01. I had a weird occurrence when I was a teenager, maybe about 15 or 16 years old. I don't remember the exact age. It was sometime in the mid-2000s. I spent almost all of my early to late teenage years in a small town called Cresco in Iowa. So let me set the scene of this story. I woke up early one Sunday morning while it was still dark out. About 5 in the morning to prepare for my paper route job. I got all my stuff ready and into my courier bag to set out for my route, leaving my house to start my career. Once I left my house, I started walking down the sidewalk to the corner of the intersection to the cross street to get to the next road to head north. I have to pass a large 3-story building that I believe used to be an old school at one point, that is now just used for storage for the fitness center that is right next door. I had a weird feeling that something was wrong, and I looked over the opening of the alleyway and saw the most bizarre and creepiest thing ever. Underneath the lamppost, illuminated by the light, was a puddle of darkness. I had no idea what it was. Ooze? I know it wasn't water. It moved and rippled like it, but it just wasn't. I stared at it for a few minutes and decided, nope, not today, and just sped walk the opposite way back to my job. I returned half an hour later while it was still dark out, and it was not there anymore. So what the heck was it? A figment of my imagination? A doorway to hell? Ooze from another world? I don't know. Cresco has had its strange and messed up stuff happen, and definitely has bouts of weirdness going on in that small town on a daily basis. I'm just looking to find answers about it. I once asked a self-proclaimed paranormal investigator about it, and they said it was probably a doorway or something to some sort of other dimension, or possibly just a creature. Halloween Horror by Anonymous. I grew up in rural Iowa, just cornfields for miles and miles. It was a pretty crappy place to grow up. Like, it'll always be home to me, and I'll always have a fair amount of affection for it, but home is where the heart is and all that BS. But even the earliest stage of life that I can remember, I wanted to leave. To put it this way, Halloween has always been my favorite holiday. But unlike the kids who would trick-or-treat in Cedar Rapids or Waterloo, who had actual neighborhoods to harvest whole sacks of candy from, we had to walk about 1.5 miles at a time just to make it to the next house. So aside from the one year when our mom drove us over to Dyersville to get a taste of how those city kids lived, trick-or-treating wasn't really an option for us. So a little backstory. Last year we were allowed to go trick-or-treating. Our immediate neighbor to the east, who lived 3 miles away, told us to go the hell away because we were getting way too big for playing kids games. This guy has begrudgingly given us a few apples some years in past, and we always resented him for it. But that year, when he told us where to go, it made us downright hate him. I mean, the entirety of the following year, me and my brother would scowl whenever my dad drove past this house. To us, he ruined the one good thing we got to do around Halloween each year. I know we were just dumb kids, but kids are also cruel and stubborn occasionally, and I guess we were just that kind of kid. So the following year, my mom decided to take us over to the Living History Farms in Urbandale. Living History Farms is a place near Des Moines that bills itself as an interactive outdoor museum that teaches people about the Midwest rural life experience. Honestly, we were not really thrilled about the visit. It wasn't exactly exciting for two boys in their early teens. I mean, learning about some of the origins of Halloween was pretty cool. I mean, a kid like me was all about hearing how Halloween was the night when spirits of the dead returned to the earth to wreak havoc to those who had wronged them in life. However, there was one particular little educational tidbit that got me and my brother's attention. And that was how our Loan ancestors used Halloween as a night to play pranks on each other. Pulling up cabbages and shrubs out of their gardens was a common trick. Wagons were pushed into the lane or the street. If the kids were ambitious, they'd hoist the cars of the victim onto their barn roof. But the most common mischief was taking your neighbor's garden or barnyard gates off the hinges and leaving them in someone else's yard. I remember the teacher lady telling us, then me and my brother just looking at each other with this wordless kind of communication like, "Oh, the neighbor is going to get it this year." So that year we snuck out of the house in the early morning hours, walked down to the neighbor's place with a screwdriver and a hammer, and did exactly that. We took his front gate off the hinges. walked like a mile down the road to his neighbor's place, then left it in the front yard. We did stuff like that for the next couple of years, each time getting more progressively bold, screwing with him harder and harder until it got to the point that we struggled to top the previous year's prank. It got to the point where we stole a considerable section of this white picket fence and just threw it into the cornfield across the highway. We put some work into that, dismantling it piece by piece so as not to make much noise and wake the guy. I mean, it sucked. We never got to hang around to see his reaction. But imagining him going outside in the morning and going insane with rage was enough to keep us amused. So this one year we walked up to his house in the middle of the night and saw something we had never experienced in a million years. This neighbor hated Halloween and never ever put up any decorations or anything. But that year we turned up to see this Grim Reaper on his front porch. It wasn't just some dumb looking scarecrow type thing either, and it seemed like the guy had put in a lot of work getting a hold of actual mannequins or stuff, as well as the spooky looking black robe stuff to dress it in. But since he was a farmer, he did have much trouble getting a hold of the old rusty And since he was a farmer, he didn't have much trouble getting a hold of an old rusty scythe leaning against it. I mean, yeah, it was kind of intimidating. He had only put it there to try to scare us off, but we weren't about to be removed from our little yearly ritual at this point. Nothing short of a tornado could deter us from getting our revenge for him being so mean to us that Halloween night. But right as we start to dismantle his fence, in almost absolute silence, I notice something out of the corner of my eye. Or rather, I see the lack of something so subtle that it takes me a minute to realize what I wasn't looking at. At some point as we were taking his fence apart, the Grim Reaper statue thing just stood up and disappeared. I stopped what I'm doing, looking around the front yard trying to spot where it could have gone. I whispered to my brother, "The Reaper is gone. Did you see it move?" At first he looks at me kinda like I'm crazy, but then he too starts getting pretty freaked out. We're just crouched down, tools in hand, in dead silence of the night, realizing that we had been a little too overconfident in our yearly pranks. We didn't quite understand what was happening. That's when things went wrong for us. "Let's get out of here," my brother whispered, and we immediately got up and started jogging back towards the highway. Then out of nowhere, the Grim Reaper is standing in front of us, with that giant old rusty scythe in his hand, blocking our escape. It hadn't been a mannequin that was set up on the front porch. It was actually him. He dressed up like some dumb decoration and just stood there still as a statue, waiting for the pranksters to arrive. There was one drawn-out moment when we locked eyes with the guy, who had taken down the hood and black robes he was wearing. Then we just bolted. But since he was blocking the way and the road out front, we had to run back through his property, climbing over a fence and into a cornfield to get away from him. He was fast for an older guy too. Like maybe it was just all the anger from having been victimized year after year, but somehow he wasn't weighed down by the scythe. And those robes, for whatever reason, he opted to keep on, didn't slow him down at all. I was scared, sure, but I figured we'd be able to get away. But remember how I said we had to scale a fence to get away? Hopping down the other side didn't go well for me. I badly sprained my ankle when I landed. That was when I got terrified when I realized I couldn't get away from the guy. My brother kept running, and I wanted to shout after him to help me, but I knew that shout would give away my position to the guy. So I kept my mouth shut. So picture this scene. I'm hiding in the cornfield, so scared that I'm covering my mouth to keep from breathing too heavily, while the furious scythe-armed guy is stalking up and down the rows looking for me. Every so often I had to just limp to a hiding spot further down away from him, trying my best not to rustle any of the stalks so I wouldn't betray my hiding spot. It was the middle of the night, and maybe the guy's eyesight or hearing was failing him, but I managed not to get myself caught. I kept stumbling further and further away until he gave up and headed back to his house. This was completely and utterly terrifying, hearing him say stuff like, "I'm gonna cut you up into little pieces and feed you to my pigs." The tone of his voice was telling me he meant every word what he said. So yeah, as you can imagine, I was pretty close to peeing my pants many times, knowing that I just couldn't get away fast enough. Needless to say, we didn't try any more pranks on that guy after that. Hometown Sinister Secret by Gold Star Tank. I grew up in a small town in east central Iowa. At first glance, there isn't much to see. It has only one stoplight on its main road. The downtown area is along the main street and is lined with old buildings from the 1940s. It has a Carnegie Library on the south side of town, and to the west you'll find the fairgrounds and the dirt track. As for the things it is known for, the town doesn't have much. A fantastic county fair that brings in people from all over the state, and a special cream crescent pastry that will keep visitors and townsfolk happy. But that's not why you're here. You want to know what dark and scary things have happened in my hometown's past. For any music lovers, you may be saddened to hear that Buddy Holly and his band had their last meal in my hometown. They had dinner at a diner called the Greasy Spoon before driving north and making their fateful flight into history. My grandmother lived in that town nearly all her life, and said that particular diner was a horrible place and went out of business decades ago. This bit of history is pretty well known among the older population and to those who like to study their town's history. But there is one more thing that is not nearly as well known. If you were to travel to the northwest side of town, you'd find lots of sprawling cornfields and a few old farmhouses dotted around the area. But in the middle of the old cornfield, sitting away from all the other buildings, stands a tall brick building called the Old Cedar County Home. The county home was built in the early 1900s as a poor farm for those less fortunate to have a place to stay and work. However, not everybody liked this idea, and on an opening day, one of the head of staff was attacked by a resident with a pitchfork. The records I have looked through have yet to say whether the poor staff member survived this attack. Later, around the 1930s, the building gained an addition in the form of a mental asylum which soon took its first patients. This particular time was a rough time for everybody in history, and the home's occupants continued to grow until World War II began. After the war, the poor farm side of the house began to diminish while the mental hospital, now called an insane asylum, continued to grow. It was at this time its most atrocious happenings took place. The head nurse of the asylum didn't like her patients very much, especially the insane women who either were or happened to become pregnant while there. The story goes that the nurse would be quite cruel to the pregnant women and make them work outside or do extra chores even though they could barely stand. When it came time to give birth, the nurse would drug the mothers so severely that they would be unconscious, and as soon as the baby was born, the nurse would take the baby away and kill it, later telling the mothers that their baby was stillborn. The nurse was let go after a while, and the home began to fall into hard times, sometime around 2004, when its last residents were transferred elsewhere, and this place was finally closed. A farmer bought the house and the land, but they still stand as a reminder of their cruel past. The locals who do know about it say that it is probably a drug den now, and most agree that it's undoubtedly haunted. As the home is on private property, exploring the remains of the building is challenging unless you want to risk getting arrested or shot at. However, some people have found a way in, shared photos online. Most of them aren't too scary except for one that caught my attention immediately. The words, quote-unquote, "I see you," were spray painted in black. The future of the home is uncertain as the farmer uses the land for storage and has left this place in particular untouched all these years. But one thing is clear, you'll never catch me out there after dark. Small Town, Iowa, by WeG211. A little backstory before we begin. I'm 17 years old, I'm a male, and I live in Iowa, presently residing in a small town, so small that it has to be in parentheses on a map. My county consists of a tight cluster of small towns, each with a seemingly unique niche of people, but it's all just the same picture in a different frame. Alright, with that out of the way, let's get to it. I'll try to keep this brief, but there's a lot of ground to cover here. Alright. A buddy of mine, we will call him Dumbo, wound up with his first girlfriend in one of these small towns, then later broke it off and moved to where he currently lives in 7th grade. The two towns are about an hour's drive apart, so fast forward a couple of years to our junior year in high school. At this point, Dumbo and I are 16, and he's shifted through a couple of girls but won't stop talking about his first girlfriend, back in 6th grade. In due time, they get back together, and him driving over to this other small town every Friday becomes regular. He stays a little later every time, and eventually starts spending the night there. On Thursday evening, we learn we won't be having school the following Friday. Dumbo and I stay up too late screwing around on video games, and he heads out at about 2 a.m. He shoots me a text shortly after saying one of his girlfriend's friends needs a date. As a complete geek, I snap at the opportunity, and we head to this small town the following morning. Long story short, it was the most disastrous 6 hours I had had in a long time. I'll spare a lot of the details, so fast forward a few months. Dumbo has since broken up with his girlfriend for unexpected reasons. Apparently she was biting him frequently, always drawing blood. She would call him almost every couple of hours, and I'm told she went berserk when he didn't pick up, leaving many voicemails, sending tons of angry text. She picked up a fascination with Twilight in recent times as well, and that translated a little too much into her real life. Despite this, Dumbo didn't break it off until November of 2014. After the breakup, she still texts him saying how she'll wait for him and all that good stuff and she'll always forgive him. Pretty odd stuff. Still needs to be finished though. Remember that girl I was set up with? She was apparently a bit too physical with Dumbo's girlfriend's sister. Not even just roughing her up a bit. She had to go to court for a R-word case. Dumbo still gets texts from this chick, and I'm told the girl I was set up with quote-unquote misses me, which gives me shivers. This is pretty outlandish and nearly unbelievable, but this is all entirely true. Some people are absolutely insane, and you should be very careful who you set your friends up with, especially if you don't know who they are. Always carry a weapon. By Anonymous. I like to run outside, and I usually have a knife with me just in case. I started doing that after they found Molly's body in Iowa, the runner who was murdered a couple of years ago. Living in the state, it really put me on edge. Well, one day I was in a bad mood, so I went for a walk and didn't think to bring my knife with me. Of course, this was the one time someone tried to bother me. So the setting is a sidewalk between an open field and some apartment buildings. I was walking with my earbuds in, listening to music, and I took a left. I walked a little way down the path and then decided to turn around and go back. When I turned, I saw a man walking towards me. Not that unusual, I guess. I do live in a rather decent-sized town in Iowa, but being on a sidewalk and all, I thought, okay, whatever, pedestrian. I prepared myself for that awkward smile, say hi, and walk by. But as I tried to get around him, I noticed he was trying to talk to me and getting in my way of going around him. I glanced and then tried to ignore him, but he walked back to catch up with me. Annoyed, I removed one earbud and he was rambling about how he wanted to know where I lived, what my name was, and other stuff. I just pointed in a random direction away from my apartment and lied about my name while picking up my pace. Then the guy asked if I was seeing anyone. I said yes, I'm married, and then he started carrying on about how he was sorry and how he didn't want to get in the middle of anything. Sure, because I would leave my husband for some random weirdo on the street. Suddenly, a girl from the apartment building across the street shouted at me and waved her arms, so I ran towards her. The guy hopped in his car, turned around, I assumed he was driving by, and pulled over to follow me, and took off. She asked if he was bothering me, and I said yes and thanked her. I don't know what would have happened if he tried to go beyond this level of creepiness, but I'm a lot more cautious now, and I never forget my knife. My terrifying experience with what I think is a skinwalker. By Connor P. This story goes way back. I believe it was either 2009 or 2010. It's hard to believe that this was over a decade ago now. Anyway, my girlfriend Lakyla and I took a road trip to visit her mom and some of her family living there on the Navajo reservation in Arizona. We also brought along our friend, Shannon, who was also of Navajo descent. We arrived there at night, and as you probably know, there isn't much electricity or anything like that on a reservation. Even running water is scarce, so it gets very dark out there at night. I found it absolutely remarkable how the stars lit up in the dark sky. You could see everything. There was no light pollution. It was like being in a planetarium. Even now, I can remember how picturesque it was. I suppose nature had to give us something beautiful before it unleashed one of its abnormalities upon us. Shannon wanted to visit her friend named Luis, and we tagged along. We soon arrived at Luis's hogan and went inside. Inside, the floor was earthen, lit only by the dim glow of kerosene lamps. It truly was a different way of life out here. Up to that point, I'd never been inside a traditional Navajo hogan, and this was all new and interesting to me. After some time, Lakyla inquired about using the restroom. "You're welcome to use the outhouse around back, but be careful. there have been some sightings of mountain lions recently. Luis handed me a .357 revolver with some rounds to load it with. You should accompany her, just to be safe. I was enthralled, and I was no stranger to pistols or anything. I loaded the cylinder, closed it up, and before we loaded out, I was ready to go. The starlight illuminated a gravel path leading to the outhouse. I was on high alert the entire time, fully expecting a mountain lion to come ripping around the corner any moment. So I was paying extra attention to my surroundings. I couldn't help but notice that things were quiet. Too quiet, if you ask me. This is typically indicative of, a large predator being around. I gripped the revolver tightly in my hand. Suddenly, I saw something moving through the brush, but it was so dark I couldn't tell if it was just my eyes playing tricks on me. The last thing I wanted to do was blow away someone's dog on a Native American reservation. Another thing I noticed was a distinct odor in the air. It smelled like someone had emptied out a year's worth of bedpans and let it saturate in the hot sun. All in all, it smelled freaking terrible. It's a good thing that I have a strong stomach, or that stench would have put any average man on his butt. Lakayla didn't seem to mind it at all, though she finished up inside and we started heading back. Something darted out of the brush as we were doing so. I raised the revolver, but I didn't shoot it first. I didn't get a good look at it. Still, it ran off quickly. As I stated before, I was a bit apprehensive about carrying a firearm on Navajo land. I didn't want to shoot anything or anyone by accident other than an attacking mountain lion. We returned to the Hogan, and I unloaded the revolver and returned it to Louise. Louise had her kids there, and it was a rather small living space. She made us feel welcomed, but I got the sense that she didn't want us to stay there. No sweat, we still had to get to Shannon's mom's house anyway. I should mention that Shannon's mom is Hopi and lives in a separate area of the reservation. To make a long story short, there is no love lost between the Hopi and Navajo tribes. Getting around the reservation can be problematic if you're unfamiliar with the area, and directions from locals could be convoluted. Well, you take a right here, then there's an old red tire over there, and then you take down that fork, you'll see it in the road, and then you make a left. So pretty much it's kind of hard to understand what the heck's actually going on. Unfortunately, the Navajo Nation is 27,000 square miles of dirt roads and dry wash arios. It's easy to get lost out there, as there's enough shrubbery to make it impossible to see in any real direction. But even she had struggled to locate the Hopi territory. The road was narrowly lined with pinyon trees and juniper bushes. As we made our way down the road, as I was driving, I kept seeing something move through the brush, keeping pace with us. Suddenly, something came out of the forest and struck the car. Holy crap, what the heck was that? I immediately hit the brakes, thinking that I might have hit someone. Shannon then leaned forward and grabbed my shoulder. Do not get out of the car, we need to keep going. I turned back to look at her. You don't think I should go check? My voice stopped. My lip began to involuntarily quiver when I saw something through my back window. It looked like a very tall person, crouching at a somewhat awkward angle. In the faint glow of the taillights, I could see what looked like an animal hide. Then a pair of two glowing eyes came into view. Oh, hell no, I said, and slammed down on the gas pedal and peeled out of there. When I looked into the rear view mirror, my worst fears came true. There was a massive creature chasing after the car, gaining on us. I knew I was not going crazy when I saw something earlier. The thing then leaped up into the air and disappeared from view, but I instantly knew where it was going to end up. I slammed on the brakes before the creature landed directly in front of us. As it stood to its feet, all three of us got a good look at its form. It appeared to be a cross between a mountain lion and some sort of human. Its bottom half resembled a pair of human legs, surmounted by a muscular torso that wore black and red markings. Its chest and torso were quite muscular. Its animalistic face leered at us with a pair of ethereal white eyes, bearing a row of sharp canines at us. It was almost grinning at us, if that makes sense. We have to get out of here, Shannon screamed as I threw the car into reverse, almost swerving off the road before quickly maneuvering the vehicle to face the opposite direction. A little trick I learned during my park ranger training. It's good to know if you need to back out of somewhere quickly, you can. As we flew back down the road, I kept looking in the rear view mirror to see if that thing was still following us, but there was nothing. which was almost as unnerving. We finally got back to the highway that led to Tuba City. "I think we lost it," I said as I took a left onto the road. But to my absolute horror, I saw something running through the forest alongside us. Now that we were back on a paved road, albeit one that was full of potholes and rocks, I was able to pick up enough speed to outrun the creature. However, it left us with a parting gift. Just before we left it in the dust, it emerged from the forest once more and struck the car again, almost causing us to spin out into a ditch. But as I was able to stabilize the car, I am certain the same chill felt crawl down each of our spines when it let out a loud, angry wail that could be heard over the car's engine with the windows rolled up. I've been through some real scary times in my life, but nothing has ever put the fear of God in me like that sound did. We finally made it out to Tuba City, and I don't think I slowed down one time that entire trip. We stopped at a gas station before driving the long way to Hopi territory. When we arrived at Shannon's mother's house, Shannon told her what had happened, speaking in hushed tones. Lakaila and I weren't sure what to do or say. We'd come face to face with an ancient creature known as a skinwalker. Not too many folks lived to tell the tale about it. Shannon's mom burnt some sage and prayed for us, but I don't think we slept a wink that night. Now, before I jump right into this next story, it's a long one. I had to connect several theories, several crimes, and several murders over several different years to be able to put this together for you. It does end up in the Redwood State Park, and I promise you it will end up in the woods at some point. But there's a few things we have to cover in the beginning so you understand why this is such a big deal and how many serial killers actually roam the woods of our great country. It could be argued that a reign of terror began in California in the late 1960s. In the South, the summer of 1969 saw the Manson family murders in Los Angeles. This included the infamous home invasion, in which actress Sharon Tate and 4 others were killed at knife or gunpoint. Tate was 8.5 months pregnant when she died. Northern California was rocked by the homicides and serial killings around the same time. This is the subject of today's video. The mysterious Zodiac killer murdered 5 people and wounded 2 others in and around San Francisco. David Faraday and Betty Jensen were fatally shot in December 1968. They were a young couple, both under the age of 18 years old. The killer shot another couple in July of 1969, 19-year-old Michael Mageau and 20-year-old Darlene Ferrin. Mageau survived, but Ferrin sadly died from her injuries. 20-year-old Brian Hartnell and 22-year-old Cecilia Shepard were stabbed in September of the same year. Hartnell survived, but Shepard passed away 2 days after the attack. The killer's next victim was Paul Stein, a 29-year-old taxi driver. He was shot nearly 2 weeks after the assault on Hartnell and Shepard. The Zodiac killer is suspected of other murders. He would contact the media to take credit for over 37 murders, but investigators don't agree on whether he was actually the perpetrator. The Zodiac killer was never caught, and his identity remains unknown to this day. He is believed to be a white male based on multiple witness statements. San Francisco is about 70 miles north of Santa Cruz. The Zodiac murders were probably too close for comfort for many Santa Cruzans. Others might have been relieved to have a distance between them and this vicious killer. Little did they know, though, Santa Cruz was about to fall victim to a killing spree of its own. The extent of it would be dubbed the murder capital of the world. The Ota residence, October 19th, 1970. On October 19th, 1970, firefighters responded to reports of a blaze in the coastal town of Sokol. The burning building has a custom-built Japanese-inspired mansion, home to eye surgeon Dr. Victor Ota and his family. 2 cars belonging to Ota and his secretary blocked access to the property. These were parked there by the killer. Once on the scene, emergency responders set out to tackle the blaze. One firefighter was searching for a fire hydrant to attach another hose when his flashlight caught something floating in the swimming pool. He took a closer look and then discovered 5 bodies in the water. The victims were identified as Dr. Victor Ota, his wife Virginia, their two sons 12-year-old Derek and 11-year-old Taggart, and Victor's secretary Dorothy Cadwallader. They were bound with silk scarves and shot to death, execution style. A note was found tucked beneath the windshield wiper of the family's Rolls Royce. The killer typed it out using Dr. Ota's very own typewriter. The note claimed that the people of the free universe would kill anyone who misuses or destroys the natural environment. The police appealed to the public for any information. They received numerous responses about a man in his mid-20s named John Lindley Frazier. He lived in a small shack about a half of a mile away from the Ota residence. He was known for telling anyone who would listen that he had been selected by God to save the environment, and rich men like Victor Ota were destroying the world. Frazier was arrested in his shack 4 days after the Ota murders. He was deemed legally sane and stood trial for 5 counts of murder. On his first day in court, he turned up with shaggy hair and a long beard on one side of his face, and a head free of hair and nothing else, even the eyebrow was missing, on the other side. He later fully shaved his head following advice from his attorney. On November 21st, 1971, he was found guilty and sentenced to death. This would be changed to life imprisonment in 1972 after the death penalty was abolished in California. Frazier took his own life in Mule Creek State Prison in 2009. The Ota's 2 teenage daughters were away at boarding school, luckily. The eldest sadly ended her own life 7 years later, though. In the days between the Ota murders and Frazier's arrest, several locals admitted to feeling afraid and sleeping with loaded guns. Unfortunately, though, this was just the beginning. Mary Ann Pesk and Anita Lucchesa, May 7th, 1972. On May 7th, 1972, 18-year-old Fresno State University students Mary Ann Pesk and Anita Lucchesa went missing. They planned to hitchhike to Stanford to visit friends and were reported missing when they never turned up. Mary Ann's skull was discovered 3 months later on the Loma Prieta mountain. A subsequent search failed to locate further remains or any sign of Anita. Aiko Koo, September 14th, 1972. And just a month later, in September, 15-year-old Aiko Koo went missing on her way to a dance class. Her mother had advised her to take the bus because she was concerned about her daughter's hitchhiking habit. Mrs. Koo suspected Aiko must have hitchhiked after missing the bus, but the police said it was more likely that Aiko had run away. Mrs. Koo printed and distributed flyers, but nobody came forward with any information. She was convinced foul play was involved. It's likely some investigators agreed to an extent considering the death of Mary Ann, but the police seemed intent on pursuing the teen runaway theory. Lawrence Whitey White, October 13th, 1972. On October 13th, 55-year-old Lawrence Whitey White was beaten to death with a baseball bat. His body was discovered the next day in the woods near Highway 9. Now, this is very brief, but it might play into the actual serial killer theory a little bit later. Mary Guilfoyle, October 24th, 1972. On October 24th, 24-year-old student Mary Guilfoyle went missing after attempting to hitchhike near Cabrillo College. Her skeletonized body was discovered in the Santa Cruz Mountains almost 4 months later, relatively close to where Mary Ann Pesk's skull was found. Father Henry Tomei, November 2nd, 1972. On November 2nd, 64-year-old Catholic priest Father Henry Tomei was stabbed and stomped to death at St. Mary's Church in Los Gatos. His body was found in the confessional booth. A witness saw the attacker fleeing the church but having only glimpsed enough to describe him as a tall, thin man. This, of course, didn't give investigators much to go on. The police initially suspected it was a robbery gone wrong. Cindy Shaw, January 7th, 1973. The murders continued into the new year. On January 7th, 1973, 18-year-old Cabrillo College student Cynthia Cindy Shaw went missing. Over the following 2 weeks, various people stumbled across dismembered body parts. Only the right hand and head were never recovered. Fingerprints from the left hand confirmed Shaw's identity. X-rays of the severed torso also matched Shaw's X-rays from the previous year. Cabrillo College and UCSC, the University of California, Santa Cruz, students were warned against hitchhiking because it seemed female hitchhikers were being targeted. UCSC students were advised to travel in pairs, always tell someone where they were going, and catch the bus even when it's inconvenient. Students were also told to wave at campus patrol cars if they needed a ride. Staff would be willing to give them a lift because of the recent murders. Jim and Joan Gianera. On the 25th of January, 25-year-old Jim Gianera and his 21-year-old wife Joan were shot dead in their home on Western Drive. Jim had a history of disturbing narcotics, so investigators assumed the murders were connected to drugs and failed to link this crime to the previous murders. Fortunately, the Gianera's child was with Joan's mother that night and survived. Kathy Francis, David Hughes, Damon Francis. January 25th, 1973. That very same day, 29-year-old Kathy Hughes and her 2 sons, 9-year-old David Hughes and 4-year-old Damon Francis, were fatally shot in their home on Mystery Shot Road. Kathy's husband, who was away at the time of the shooting, also dealt drugs, plus their house was previously occupied by Jim Gianera, so these murders were again assumed to be related to narcotics of some kind. Rosalind Thorpe and Allison Louis. On February 5th, 2 UCSC students, 23-year-old Rosalind Thorpe and 20-year-old Allison Louis, disappeared. Both women were reported missing the next day. Their friends feared the worst and searched the woods but found no sign of them. And now we finally come upon where you all have been waiting for, the Henry Cowell Redwood State Park murders, February 10th, 1973. On February 10th, 4 teenage friends were camping at Henry Cowell Redwood State Park. The park is situated between the cities of Santa Cruz and Scotts Valley near the town of Felton. The main section of the park contains over 15 miles of hiking trails, which some have led to lonely beaches along the San Lorenzo River. Other paths boast breathtaking views of the Santa Cruz Mountains. It's ordinarily a beautiful place to enjoy nature, but in February 1973, 9-year-old Brian Scott Card, 18-year-olds David Oliker and Robert Spector, and 15-year-old Mark Drybelbis were fatally shot with a .22 caliber pistol. After the media descended, District Attorney Peter Chang was heard muttering, "This must be Murdersville, USA." Several news outlets reported him referring to Santa Cruz as the murder capital of the world. Chang claimed he was misquoted, but considering the disturbing amount of high numbers of recent murders, in which victims were often seemingly targeted at random, many Santa Cruzans were understandably frightened. The last few years had indeed felt like living in the murder capital of the world. As a side note, Henry Cowell Redwood State Park became a serial killer's hunting ground once again in 1981 when David Carpenter shot a couple who were hiking. The male victim survived, but the female was fatally wounded. Fred Perez, February 13th, 1973. 3 days after the campers were killed in the park, 72-year-old Fred Perez was weeding in front of his yard, outside of his home in Lighthouse Avenue, when a car passed, circled back, and then pulled over nearby. The driver got out, seemingly at random, and fatally shot Perez with a rifle in broad daylight. Neighbors and witnesses recorded the shooter's license plate. This led to a suspect being stopped and arrested shortly after the shooting. The man's name was Herbert Mullen. Herbert Mullen was born April 18th, 1947. He was popular at school growing up. At home, his father was reportedly strict but not abusive. When Mullen was 16, he was voted most likely to succeed by his classmates. However, he also began to struggle around this time. One of his close friends died in a car accident. Mullen made shrines to his friend and began to obsess over various things, including reincarnation. He also started hearing voices. By his mid-20s, he was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia and had been repeatedly admitted to mental health facilities. When he wasn't in a hospital, his use of LSD and marijuana might have amplified his symptoms. With Mullen in custody, the police were able to question him and learn more about his crimes and motivations. Mullen's birthday fell on the anniversary of the 1906 San Francisco earthquake. He believed this meant he was responsible for preventing further quakes, and the human bloodshed that he would subsequently go after would prevent these natural disasters. He said the Vietnam War averted earthquakes on American soil, but with the war ending for Americans, more deaths would be required to prevent another quake. He heard voices reinforcing this message. Often, this was the voice of his father. Mullen pretended he had car trouble when he came across Lawrence White on the highway. White offered to help him in exchange for a ride. Mullen said White sent telepathic messages offering himself as a sacrifice so the others could be saved. Mullen claimed his father telepathically instructed him to kill Mary Guilfoyle. He picked her up when she was hitchhiking and then stabbed her through the chest while driving. He then sliced open her body looking for pollution, removing her organs and hanging them on tree branches for examination. Having doubts about his actions, he visited Father Henry Tomei to confess. As with Lawrence White, Mullen allegedly believed the priest offered himself as a sacrifice. Tomei was stabbed and beaten to death in his confessional booth. In early 1973, Mullen blamed his former drug use for his problems. He went to confront Jim Gianera, one of his high school classmates who had given him drugs back in the day. Mullen went to Gianera's former residence, where a woman named Kathy Francis answered the door. She told him the Gianeras lived down the road now. At the correct house, Mullen shot Jim Gianera, who crawled to tell his wife Joan to lock herself in the bathroom, but Mullen kicked down the door before shooting her too. Both Gianeras died from their injuries. Thankfully, their child was at Joan's mother's house that night. Mullen returned to the Francis household where he shot Kathy and her two sons, allegedly believing Kathy telepathically offered herself and her children as sacrifices. Although there are some disputes over whether he murdered Kathy and her sons before leaving to kill the Gianeras. The following month, Mullen was hiking in Henry Cowell Redwood State Park when he came across 4 friends who were camping illegally. He pretended to be a park ranger and told them to leave because they were polluting the forest. He later returned and shot them with a .22 caliber pistol because they were still there. He took their .22 caliber rifle, which he used to kill Fred Perez in broad daylight a few days later, leading to his arrest. But some press outlets reported that Mullen was not only known to Jim Gianera, but also to Fred Perez and Kathy Francis's widower. It is unclear how well acquainted they actually were. In August 1973, Mullen was sentenced to life imprisonment. He was denied parole 8 times and remained incarcerated until his death in August of 2022. He died of natural causes at the age of 75. In the immediate aftermath of Mullen's arrest, many Santa Cruzans breathed a sigh of relief, thinking the killer was caught and the worst was over. Mullen's victims differed in age, gender, race, and religion. His methods and weapons also varied. Most of the victims were shot, but some were stabbed and or beaten. This is why investigators struggled to connect his crimes prior to his arrest. If Mullen hadn't confessed, it's possible we wouldn't have linked him to many of these murders. Mary Guilfoyle was the only female hitchhiker Mullen confessed to killing. Some people thought, or perhaps hoped, Mullen was also responsible for abducting the other hitchhikers. But a few days after Mullen's arrest, road workers stumbled upon human remains just off Eden Canyon Road in Castro Valley. At first, the workers thought they were looking at discarded mannequins, but they soon realized they had found 2 headless and dismembered corpses. The bodies were later identified as Allison Louis and Rosalind Thorpe. Panic erupted, with people asking how bodies were still turning up if Mullen was off the streets. District Attorney Peter Chang replied, "We then have another homicidal maniac." Thorpe and Louis went missing before Mullen's arrest, so his involvement wasn't impossible. But both women had been sexually violated, as had Cindy Shaw. This, along with the dismembering, wasn't consistent with Mullen's usual MO. There wasn't much doubt at this point that two serial killers had been stalking Santa Cruz at the same time, and only one of them was in custody currently. Chang did try to imply out-of-town killers could be using Santa Cruz as a dumping ground, but this didn't really make sense because the victims were all local college students. When an acquaintance calls. In late April 1973, the Santa Cruz Police Department received a call made from a phone back in Pueblo, Colorado. The caller confessed to killing his mother and her best friend. Recognizing the voice as belonging to a local man named Big Ed, the police laughed and told him to stop messing with them. Big Ed, full name Edmund Kemper, called again a few hours later, and this time, the call led to his arrest. He confessed to murdering a further 6 women: Mary Ann Pesk, Anita Lucchesa, Aiko Koo, Cindy Shaw, Rosalind Thorpe, and Allison Louis. Edmund Kemper was born December 18, 1948. He was known to torture insects as a child, and he killed 2 family cats before dismembering one and decapitating the other. His mother, Clarnell, struggled with alcohol addiction. She often abused and belittled Edmund, her only son. This included mocking him for his height. He was 6'4", telling him no one would ever love him, and locking him in the basement because she feared he would hurt and molest his sisters. The abuse worsened after his parents split in 1957, and his father, who he was close to, moved out. Edmund was later sent to live with his paternal grandparents. He didn't enjoy this time with them. He said his grandfather was senile and his grandmother emasculated both him and his grandfather. At the age of 15, he shot his grandmother with a rifle following an argument. His grandparents had previously confiscated the rifle after Edmund used it to needlessly shoot animals. His grandmother's last words were reportedly, "You'd better not be shooting the birds again." When his grandfather returned home from a grocery run, Edmund fatally shot him in the driveway. He later said, "I just wondered how it would feel to shoot Grandma," and claimed he killed his grandfather so he wouldn't have to learn about his dead wife. Kemper was arrested and later diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. He was sent to Estacadero State Hospital for the criminally insane. He was released on parole into the care of his mother, and on his 21st birthday, he was a free man. Clarnell had married and divorced while Edmund was in hospital, so she now had the last name Strandberg. She worked as an administrative assistant at the University of California, Santa Cruz. Edmund's juvenile record was expunged after psychiatrists deemed him rehabilitated. He aspired to work in law enforcement, but he was rejected because, being 6'9", he was considered too tall to be a police officer. Despite this, he was well liked by local police officers. He frequented bars where they hung out. One officer gave him a police academy trainee's badge. During this time, his home life remained turbulent. His neighbors often heard him embroiled in loud arguments with his mother. He moved out after saving some money, but would often return to his mother's home due to financial difficulties. He took to driving around university areas frequented by young female hitchhikers. He claimed he picked up upwards of 150 women and drove them to their destination. These weren't quite the uneventful rides most of his passengers thought they would have, though, because Kemper hid weapons in the car and attempted to lock passengers in without them noticing. A woman seemed reluctant to travel with a giant lone man. He would look at his watch, feigning impatience. This usually worked because it pressured the women to make a quick decision and gave the impression he didn't care one way or another about giving them a ride. He picked up Marianne and Anita, offering to take them to Stanford, but instead he took them to an isolated area in the woods in Alameda where he stabbed them and strangled them to death. Anita was locked in the trunk while he first killed Marianne. He took the bodies home, getting pulled over by the police on the way for a broken taillight. The officer didn't detect anything else was amiss, and Kemper was sent on his way. Back at his apartment, he did terrible things to the bodies and photographed the corpses. He then dismembered the bodies and discarded them in the mountains. Aiko Koo and Cindy Shaw were killed and violated in a very similar way. Kemper buried Cindy's head in his mother's garden facing her bedroom because his mother always wanted people to look up to her. He would often assault and do very unfortunate things to these severed heads of the victims repeatedly before disposing of them. Rosalind Thorpe and Alice Lee were abducted, murdered, and violated after struggling to get home on public transport. They accepted Kemper's offer of a ride because he had a UCSC sticker on his car. The advice the university issued to students claimed drivers with stickers would get them to their destination safely. Kemper was able to obtain a sticker because his mother worked at the university. Thorpe was picked up first, so Louis was probably reassured by both the sticker and another woman being in the car. But Kemper was able to overpower both victims with his strength and size. On April 20th, 1973, Kemper bludgeoned his mother with a claw hammer while she slept and slit her throat with a penknife. He dismembered the body, violated the severed head before using it as a dartboard. He put his mother's corpse in a closet and went out to a bar. After returning home, he invited his mother's 59-year-old friend Sally Hallett over to watch a movie, but strangled her to death when she arrived. He fled to Colorado thinking he would be a prime suspect in his mother's murder. When there was no mention of it on the radio, he realized the bodies might not have been found yet. He stopped at a payphone and confessed. He later said he called the police because the original purpose was gone, and he was, at that point, too tired to keep going on. He was tried in October 1973. He pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity. The psychiatrist deemed him legally sane because he showed signs of malice intent, and that he was aware that his crimes were wrong. On November 8th, he was sentenced to 7 to life for each of the 8 murders, to be served subsequently. He's been repeatedly denied parole over the years, and remains at the California Medical Facility in Vacaville, where he narrated hundreds of audiobooks as part of the prisoner program. He is currently 74 and eligible to reapply for parole next year. At one point, Kemper and Mullen were actually incarcerated at the same prison. Kemper said he hated Mullen, calling Mullen a cold-blooded killer who murdered people for no good reason. He didn't believe Mullen heard voices telling him to kill his victims. Kemper also claims he trained Mullen to stop bothering people when they were watching TV by throwing water on him when he was being annoying and giving him peanuts when he was quiet. It's likely Kemper was bullying Mullen to some extent considering the size difference between the two men. Kemper also has a very high IQ, so he would be capable of outsmarting most of his fellow inmates. And that there is the story of how 2 serial killers simultaneously were killing people, leaving their bodies all over the cities, all in the woods, and even killing people in state parks. Now, I do have plans to cover an actual state park killer very, very soon, but I wanted to cover this story because I felt like it would be fun. It's definitely a classic, and I know a lot of people have been requesting more wilderness crime type stuff. Now, I do have more coming soon. They will be more in-depth, but it does take time, and I do appreciate all of your patience. Thank you so much for supporting The Swamp. My Terrifying Time at O'Neill Butte by Jeremy of Rome. I've always been an adrenaline junkie, so when my friends invited me on a rock climbing trip to O'Neill Butte, you know I could not resist. I heard stories about the area being haunted, but I brushed them off as folklore. But little did I know, those stories would become my reality. We arrived at the butte early in the morning, and I couldn't help but feel a sense of unease as we started our ascent. O'Neill Butte is a towering sandstone monolith located in the heart of Sedona, Arizona. It's known for its challenging routes and stunning views, but there's more to this butte than meets the eye. As we climbed higher, the air grew colder and the wind picked up. It felt as if we were being watched, but every time I turned to look, there was never anything there. I tried to shake off the feeling and focus on the climb, but it only got worse. That's when we reached the halfway point and everything changed. My friend, who was leading the climb, suddenly froze in place. I asked him what was wrong, but he didn't want to respond. It was as if he was in some sort of trance. That's when I heard it. A low whispering that seemed to be coming from the rock itself. I looked around frantically, but I couldn't see anything. The whispering grew louder and more frantic, and I felt like I was losing my mind. That's when I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. It was a figure, but it was unlike anything I had ever seen before. It was tall and thin with impossibly long limbs and a face that was distorted beyond recognition. It seemed to be made of a shadow and mist. It was moving towards us at an alarming rate. I shouted at my friend, but he didn't respond. I knew we had to get down and fast. I started to descend as quickly as I could, but my hands were shaking, and my feet kept slipping. That's when I felt a hand on my ankle. I knew I was in trouble at this point. I looked down to see the figure climbing to me, its eyes glowing in otherworldly light. I screamed and kicked, trying to shake it off, but it was no use. It was as if it had its grip on me. That was stronger than any rock or metal. That's when I heard a voice in my head, clear as day. It said,
"You're not leaving here alive."
I closed my eyes and prayed for a miracle, but I opened them and the figure was gone. My friend was still in his trance, but he eventually snapped out of it and we made our way back down to the ground. To this day, I don't know what the heck happened up there on O'Neill Butte. All I do know is that something evil lurks there, and it's not to be trifled with. I'll never forget that climb and the horror that still lingers in my mind. Rock Climbing Horror Story by Centennial Climber 95. I remember the day I decided to go on a rock climbing trip in Colorado. I had been planning it for months, gathering all the necessary equipment and reading up on the best spots in the area. My friends and I were thrilled to embark on this adventure, and we could not wait to explore the beautiful and rugged landscapes of the Rockies. We set out early in the morning, driving towards the trailhead that would take us to our first destination, the Garden of Gods. It was a majestic and awe-inspiring place with towering red rock formations that seemed to defy gravity. As we started our climb, I couldn't help but feel a sense of exhilaration and adrenaline rush through my body. The views were breathtaking and the sense of accomplishment that came with each successful ascent was indescribable. But as the day wore on, something started to feel off. We had been climbing for quite some hours, and the sun was starting to set, casting long shadows across the landscape. I couldn't shake that feeling that we were being watched, that there was something lurking in the shadows, waiting for us to make a mistake. My friends, they brushed it off fairly easily, telling me I was just being paranoid, but I could not shake the feeling. It was like a cold chill had settled in my bones, and no matter how hard I tried, I could not shake it. As the darkness descended, we made camp, building a fire to keep warm, and cooked our dinner. But as we settled in for the night, things took a turn for the worse. We started hearing strange noises, like something moving in the shadows. At first, we brushed it off as just some sort of animal, but the noises, they continued to get closer and more persistent, and we could tell that this had to be something human by the way they were moving. It was not until we heard the sound of rocks being thrown that we realized we were in some serious trouble. We huddled together, trying to stay warm, but the fear was palpable. We were in the middle of nowhere, with no cell reception and no way to call for help. We were completely at the mercy of whatever was out there in the darkness. And then, just as quickly as it started, the noise stopped, but that was just before we began to hear what sounded like multiple more footsteps join them. We spent the rest of the night huddled together, barely sleeping, waiting for morning to come. The moment the sun rose, all the noises stopped in unison, and it sounded like they were all running away in the opposite direction. We packed up our gear immediately and started the long trek back to civilization. We never did figure out what the heck was stalking us that night, if it was a person, a group of people, I don't know. The memory of that experience, though, will stay with me for years to come. To this day, I can't help but feel a sense of unease whenever I think about this trip, and I always make sure to keep an extra eye out for any signs of danger when I'm out in the wilderness. But that's why I'm submitting this story to Swamp Dweller. I would love to know in the comments if you guys have any idea what the heck happened. The Creeper Who Didn't Get the Hint by Anonymous. So I had gone to the indoor rock climbing place that I have gone to many times in my life with my friends. It was a great way to exercise and challenge ourselves while having a fun time. But on this particular night, our fun was about to be disrupted in the most unsettling way. As we arrived at the climbing gym, I noticed a man who seemed to be staring at me intently. He was tall with unkempt hair and a scraggly beard. He wore a tattered hoodie and jeans that looked like they hadn't been washed in quite some time, multiple weeks at the very least. I tried to shake off the feeling of discomfort, thinking maybe I had just been paranoid because I had drank a lot of soda that day and I was pretty hyped up on caffeine. But as we started climbing, the man continued to watch me. He stood in the corner of the gym, barely moving around at all, his eyes glued to me. I could feel his gaze on me as I climbed, and it made me feel absolutely uneasy. My friends didn't seem to notice anything was wrong, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off with this guy. As we took a break, the man approached us. He introduced himself as Mike and asked if we needed any help with our climbing. I declined, but he persisted, offering tips and advice. His voice was low and raspy, and every time he spoke I could feel his breath on my neck. I tried to be polite, but his presence made me feel more than uncomfortable. We continued climbing, but I couldn't focus on anything but the man. He started making creepy comments like,
You have strong arms, and I like the way you move.
My friend still didn't seem to notice anything, and I didn't want to ruin our night, so I did try to ignore him. But the man didn't stop there. As I was climbing, he started circling the base of the wall, muttering under his breath. I couldn't hear what he was saying, but his voice was deep and guttural. Suddenly, he lunged at me, grabbing my leg and pulling me down. I screamed and my friends rushed to my side, asking me what happened. The man just stood there with a sickening grin on his face. I could feel his eyes on me and I knew I had to get out of there. We quickly packed up our gear and left the gym, but as we were leaving, the man grabbed my arm and whispered in my ear, See you soon. I didn't sleep that night, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the man was still watching me. I was afraid to leave my house, terrified that he would be waiting for me. It wasn't until a few days later that I saw news reports about a man matching his description being arrested for assaulting a young woman at the same gym we had been at. The thought of what could have happened to me if my friends had not been there still haunts me to this day, and I don't think I can ever really go rock climbing again because of that sense of unease I get. The PTSD is just too real. The Invisible Creature on the Roof by Swamp Dweller. Now, this story isn't a rock climbing story, but it is a personal story of mine that I wanted to share with you all. I shared this in a video many years ago, but I'd like to share it for anybody who's new. I grew up in rural areas my entire life. Whether it was beef farms in Tennessee or living in the middle of nowhere, Florida, I've done it all, really. Growing up without access to most commonalities we have all grown accustomed to. That's right, we had no internet, no TV, and you guessed it, no cell phones. I know, the horror. We are the last actual generation before the internet age, I like to think. Dial-up was around, but it was something most of us didn't have access to at the time. But honestly, it wasn't all that bad outside of the long, dull summer days when we would be cooking alive in the fields picking green beans. Living in an old Civil War cabin in the middle of nowhere, Tennessee, shelled out some exciting experiences. This story will be one of the many I may share if you all enjoy it. This story starts like any other. It was a typical Friday night and my brothers and I were home alone. As we didn't have much to entertain ourselves with, we began playing search in and around the house, which is basically like hide and seek. We mostly opted to stay indoors as it was pitch black outside. For more context, our cabin was on a steep hill with a long winding driveway. Our place had a basement level, the main level where most of the house was, and the upstairs that only had my room. We also had a back deck that was about 10 to 12 feet in the air. Anyway, back to the story at hand. It was pitch black outside, and going much further than the front porch at that time was something many of us didn't want to do. The game was fun but needed more variety, and with the little room we had inside, it did get kinda stale. At this point, I thought of wandering outside and hiding on the roof to make the game a bit more interesting. This would soon be one of my biggest regrets in life. At first, everything did seem fine. It was rather cold as it was nearing fall and the weather was starting to change. There was a slight breeze and the air was crisp and calming. After a few minutes of sitting on the roof, something felt off. I had been practically mesmerized by the sound of crickets and cicadas. I realized, though, that all the noise had suddenly stopped. This to me seemed very odd, but at the same time, being a naive teenager, I didn't realize that this only meant something terrible was going to happen. I sit there as still as possible for a moment, trying to listen as closely as I can. I can't hear anything besides the slight breeze through the leaves. Then, an eruption of noise came from the other end of the roof as quickly as the silence came. For a bit more detail, we had a metal roof, making it very easy to hear when things walk on top of it. It sounded like something had landed on the opposite end of the roof. I looked over but could see nothing. This left me somewhat unnerved, and my first thought was to exit the situation. However, before panicking fully, I remembered it could be my brothers messing with me, since they did probably give up looking for me by now inside. I opened up my window and called my brothers. They both ran up the stairs shouting and complaining that the roof was off limits. As my oldest brother got to me, I asked him if he had been messing with me and making noise on the roof. He, of course, denied this and wanted to come up and investigate. So he and I slowly made our way to the middle of the roof and listened. Just for a moment. Everything went quiet around us as it had earlier. At this point, I was already on edge, ready to karate chop a demon in the neck if I had to. Then, we hear what sounds like a pounding noise on the far end of the roof, in the opposite direction of where we are standing. After 3 sets of 6 pounding noises, it charged us. Well, I think it did anyway. It sounded like hooves were running on the metal roof, but the only issue was we couldn't see a damn thing. The entire roof was clear, aside from us, that is. But somehow we heard these footsteps. It quickly approached us and began running circles around us. I held out my arms, trying to see if I could feel anything, but I couldn't. The weirdest part is that I could feel the vibrations of something running around us, but I could see nothing tangible. The footsteps circled us for many minutes, but was probably no more than a minute at most. Suddenly, it ran off to the other side of the roof and seemingly jumped and disappeared into thin air. We quickly ran inside, locked the windows and doors, and huddled up inside, freaked the hell out. To this day, I still don't really know what I experienced, but I can tell you this, there are things we cannot explain out there in this world, and this was one of the many experiences I've had that definitely reaffirms that. Mountain Biking Turned Deadly by Luke. My name is Luke and I am now 20 years old. This story happened to me when I was 17. This experience still gives me chills to this day. In May 2017, I found myself going out a lot more on my mountain bike. I was getting bored of cruising around the streets, so I wanted to go out for a trail, woodland bike ride. I have never been to Lee Woods before then. Personally, I do not think I will ever go alone again. After some research into different areas, Lee Woods seemed to be the best bet. Living only a couple of miles away was a nice bike ride. On arriving, it looked very peaceful, and I was almost in a dreamlike state by my first look at the place. For a woodland area in England, let alone Bristol, it was amazing. On going into the woods, I remembered seeing different colors at the start of each trail, signifying difficulty for bikers and length for walkers. Don't take my word on that bit, I still have no clue what they mean, honestly. So I decided to go down the blue-colored trail to see what was down there. Finding it exciting, I decided to go down the harder trail, and now, here's where it starts to get weird.
I began having this weird sort of vision looking around as if I'm being swallowed by the woodland. Everything felt like it was getting bigger and further away. I brushed it off, but it turns out I lost track of time. I got lost on the trail. Now keep in mind I am very observant and aware of my surroundings. I then came to a strange opening. I could go left in the rough direction of the way out or right deeper into the woods. Me being me, I decided to go deeper into the woods. I came to a weird little trail that just had dodgy written all over it, metaphorically speaking. I went against my gut feeling of turning back and went down there. I came to a point of which the trail continued, but it was getting very dangerous, the trail being too bumpy for me to even walk down. I then turned back, but for a few minutes before turning back, I do not know why, but I was just standing still, staring down the trail. I felt like I was being watched from all angles, even though it would be near impossible to have that many eyes surrounding me in that area. I got nervous and began walking back up the hill as I was too tired to ride at this point. Keep in mind, my bike tires are completely solid, with no punctures, slow punctures, or even anything wrong at all. I wish I still had the pictures of the bike. Upon getting back to the spot where I originally went to the trail, that weird loss of time thing began. It felt as if the whole path had stretched by a half a mile, as if the woodland was moving. I began walking up the path feeling that same eerie sensation of being watched as I did beforehand. This time, it felt a bit more sinister. It felt as if something were about to happen. Bearing in mind, I had not seen a single person now since I went down that first trail. I will explain the scenery before continuing. It is a long path, a slightly steep hill to my left, a narrow river to my right, maybe 4 feet deep and 4 feet wide. Bushes are on the other side of the river, with the odd tree every now and then. Upon getting about a quarter of the way up the slowly inclining path, I hear a woman crying behind a tree up ahead. I start slowing down my walking pace to try and get a look behind the tree, but the whole time I am thinking to myself, why would someone jump across to cry behind a tree? So I edge closer to the river to look behind to see if the person is okay. Also because many people go to Lee Woods to commit suicide, so I was hoping that maybe I could help this person. But you guessed it, there is no one there and the crying stopped. A bit weirded out, I just slowly turned away and started walking again, a bit quicker as I was unnerved. I have had a few paranormal experiences before this, but not in a place like this, never in the woods. Usually it was in a house or some sort of building, so this was new to me. I had this sudden shiver as I was walking. Maybe a minute or so later, only a couple of meters away where I heard the crying, it started again, but this time it was opposite of me across the river. I did not bother looking. I started just going again in a bit of a jog. As I got faster, I heard the bushes rustling, as if there was something following me. Upon hearing this, I sped up and the crying became more and more hysterical. Bear in mind, my bike was fine before this moment in time. I have thought to myself, F this, I am gone. I try to hop on my bike with the adrenaline that was rushing through me, and I had come to an almost sudden stop. My back tire on my bike had become completely flat out of nowhere, so I had no other choice but to sprint with my bike and pray for the best, and that I do not trip or end up having to throw it and run faster. With the crying person still close to me and keeping up, I am running faster and faster, praying I just get off this path that I was on. I had that feeling of wanting to cry because I could not actually do anything to help the situation or get out of it any faster. And after what felt like an hour but was probably only 5 or 10 minutes, I could see the car park. The crying had stopped following me and getting closer and started moving back down to where I first heard it. I sprinted out into the car park. I must have been as white as a sheet of paper and hysterical with my breathing and wheezing as multiple people in the car park turned to look at me like I was crazy. I saw the exit sign out of the car park and ran towards it, and whilst doing so, I noticed my bike to be moving a lot smoother. I could not believe that my bike tire had suddenly regained all of its air. It was solid again, as it was before the unnerving crying person shenanigans. I jumped on my bike and got away from Lee Woods as fast as I could, and have never gone back, as every person I tell this story becomes more reluctant to go there with me. The thing that makes this story so scary to me is I have Irish heritage. In Irish folklore, there is a demon that we call the Banshee. She is seen in woodlands next to rivers and lakes washing blood off clothes. It is said that if you see her washing blood off clothes, the person who owns those clothes will die. Alternatively, if you hear her crying, it means death. I cannot remember the meanings exactly of the deaths, but it means either you or a loved one will die. Since 2017, I have lost my auntie, 2 of my best friends, and a dog. Lee Woods is no joke. There are many stories that have come out of Lee Woods too. You can read online about them. Search up Lee Woods, Leigh. It is rated 87th most haunted place in the UK according to Higgy Pop. It is a popular spot in Bristol for suicides, or it was at least. Even the ghost of Isambard Kingdom Brunel has been spotted there, looking over the suspension bridge, which he designed. I may submit some more stories soon, as I have a couple of more experiences I have had over the years.
The Abandoned Cabin by Jonah G. I've always enjoyed hiking, but I never really expected to lose myself in the woods behind my local park. Now, at the time, it was getting kind of dark, and I started to panic. I tried retracing my steps, but everything looked the same. The trees towered above me, blocking out the moonlight, and the only sound was the rustling of leaves under my feet. Then, as I stumbled through the undergrowth, I saw something that made me stop in my tracks altogether. It was a small, dilapidated cabin. Its roof caved in and its walls were covered in moss. I approached, albeit cautiously, my heart pounding in my chest. As I stepped inside, I was hit by a wave of musty air. The cabin was dark and I could barely see my hand in front of my face. I fumbled in my backpack for a flashlight and turned it on, illuminating the dark room. It was empty, except for a few cobwebs and some old furniture covered in dust. But as I shone the light around the room, I noticed something on the floor. It was a small pile of bones, picked clean and bleached by the elements. My stomach turned, and I felt a bile rising in my throat. What had happened here? And did I find something that I shouldn't have seen? As I turned around to leave, something caught my eye outside the window. I stepped closer and peered out, my heart racing. It was a clearing, and in the center was a circle of stones covered in strange symbols. A small fire was in the process, and I could see shadows moving around it. I instantly felt my legs go weak and I stumbled backward, tripping over something on the floor. I looked down and saw it was a small journal, its pages yellowed and brittle. I picked it up, and as I started to read, the horror of what had happened here began to unfold. The journal belonged to a man who had lived in the cabin at some point or another. He had been a hermit, shunned by society, and turned to dark magic to seek revenge on those who had wronged him. He had summoned a demon, which I guess had apparently possessed him, driving him to commit unspeakable acts of violence and depravity. As I read on, my hands were shaking. I realized that the shadows I had seen outside were not just shadows. They were the demonic creatures the hermit had summoned, and they were coming for me. I ran outside the cabin, my heart pounding, and stumbled through the woods. I could hear the creatures behind me, their growls and snarls echoing. I could hear the creatures behind me, their growls, their snarls echoing through the trees. I saw the park lights in the distance, and I ran toward them, praying for safety. I burst out of the woods, panting and covered in sweat, and collapsed. I looked back, but there was nothing there. Nothing was chasing me. The creatures were gone now, and the woods were silent once more. But the memory of what I had seen would haunt me for the rest of my life. I knew I had stumbled onto something awful in those woods and narrowly escaped with my life. Even 10 plus years later, I'm a full-grown man now, and I still have no explanation for how I felt that pure feeling of dread that came over me. If anybody in the comments has any idea what I could have seen, what I could have experienced, please let me know. What Is That Smell? By NatureBot420. I've always enjoyed hiking and exploring the outdoors, but today's adventure in the woods is a nightmare that I'll never forget. Now, I had been wandering for hours in the woods like I typically do on the weekends, but I guess I had somehow lost all sense of direction after a while, probably because I was so enthralled in the podcast I was listening to. Yet, every step takes me deeper into the forest. As I trudge on, my anxiety grows with each passing minute. The trees lower above me like dark sentinels, their branches twisted and gnarled, reaching out to grab me. The silence is oppressive, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or the snap of twig underfoot. Suddenly, a putrid smell assaults my nostrils. It's a sickly sweet odor mixed with something rotten and decaying. My mind begins to race as I try to pinpoint the source of the stench. I'm almost afraid to move, fearful of what I might find. But obviously, I can't stay still forever. I take a tentative step forward, the leaves crunching loudly beneath my feet. The smell grows more potent, more intense. My stomach churns and bile rises in my throat. I feel like I'm about to hurl, but then I see it. A dead animal lies just ahead. Its bloated body swarming with flies. The sight and smell are overpowering, and I must cover my mouth and nose to keep from gagging. I turn away, but there's no escape. The scent lingers, clinging to my clothes, the air, and even my skin. I stumble forward, desperate to distance myself from the rotting corpse, but the smell seems to follow me, like a malignant presence. I can't shake it off. Finally, panic sets in and I run blindly through the forest. The trees blur past me, the ground uneven beneath my feet. I can hear my heart pounding in my ears. Something just feels wrong. I'm not even sure why I'm freaking out. It's just a dead animal after all. But there was just this overwhelming feeling that came over me the moment I saw that body. I just felt like I shouldn't be seeing this. At this point, I am hopelessly lost with no idea how to find my way back. And still, the smell persists. It's everywhere, surrounding me, suffocating me. I feel like I'm drowning in it. As I run, I catch glimpses of other dead animals scattered throughout the woods. Now, that feeling I felt earlier is starting to make sense and clicking in my head all at once. Some of these animals are bloated and putrid like the first, while others are little more than skeletons picked clean by scavengers. The smell grows stronger with each passing moment until all I can think about is that nauseating stench. I don't know how much longer I can keep going. My legs, they're feeling like lead. My lungs are burning with exertion. But I know in my heart that I cannot stop, not when this smell is so overpowering. It's like a beacon, leading me deeper and deeper into the woods to my own demise. And that's when I hear it. This low growling noise coming from somewhere just ahead of me. It's a sound that will forever send shivers down my spine. It makes the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. I know, deep down, that it is not an animal. It's definitely not anything that I want to meet. But I can't turn back now. I'm trapped in this nightmare with no escape, so all I can do is keep running and hoping to find my way out of this nightmare. I keep on going, and I never actually see where this creature is, this person, or whatever could possibly be lurking out here in this graveyard, I guess. But I just kept running, legs burning, feet hurting, lungs on fire. I honestly thought I was going to collapse and pass out at any moment. And just when I was about to give up and lay down and die, I break the bushes, and there I am, back into a clearing, a road just ahead of me, and there's civilization once more. I don't know how to explain what I went through. I don't even know what the heck was going on out there. I do plan on probably going back sometime soon to see if we can find these bodies, get some video evidence, and see if maybe anybody local has any idea as to what the heck is going on here. Our Ski Trip Turned Nightmare by Jerome Frogman. I remember the excitement as I put on my ski gear and joined my friends for a day on the slopes. The weather was perfect, the fresh snowfall made the scenery even more beautiful. We hit the trails and spent the morning skiing and having a great time. But as the day wore on, we decided to venture off the beaten path and explore the more remote parts of the woods. We thought we knew the area pretty well, but we soon lost ourselves in the dense forest. The snow was falling heavily now. The visibility was rapidly decreasing. The panic didn't really begin to set in until we realized we were completely disoriented and honestly had no freaking idea where to go. We tried to retrace our steps, but the trees and the snow made it almost impossible to recognize any sort of landmark. Of course, as cliché, our freaking phones had no signal. The batteries were running low. We huddled together trying to stay warm, but the cold was honestly biting and relentless. As the night began to fall, strange noises started to fill the forest around me. It sounded like something was moving around us, circling us, if you will. We could hear the sound of branches snapping and footsteps crunching the snow, but we could never actually see anything. We tried to reassure ourselves it was just wildlife, but the noises were getting louder and more menacing. Now I need to stop for a second and explain just how we were feeling mentally. Obviously, physically, we were absolutely cold, we were shaking, and we were terrified. But mentally, I felt like we were pretty all there, we weren't that far away from the ski resort. We were on the slopes just outside of them anyways, in the forest. I mean, we couldn't have gotten too far, right? There's no way we could have gotten that lost. I began to start to feel a strong sense of dread as we realized that we were not alone. We huddled together, scared and unsure of what to do. Then, suddenly, we heard a blood-curdling scream that echoed through the woods. We froze, too terrified to move. We knew that something was out there, something that meant harm to us. We decided to try to find our way out of those woods regardless of how dark it was. But again, the snow was deep, and our strength waned. We stumbled through the dark, our legs aching and our hearts pounding. We were lost, alone, and at the mercy of the unknown. Adrenaline was the only thing keeping us moving at this point. As the night dragged on, we became more and more exhausted as it got colder and colder. Finally, when we were on the verge of collapse, we saw the lights of our rescue team in the distance. Relief flooded through us as we realized we were going to be rescued. We stumbled towards the lights, our legs weak and our bodies numb. Looking back on that night, though, I've learned so much. I realized how close we came to tragedy. The forest can be dangerous, and it's important to respect its power. I'll never forget the terror of being lost in the woods, hunted by an unknown force, or at least maybe what I felt like was an unknown force, and it's a memory that still haunts me to this very day. Now, I know what a lot of people will think as they hear the end of the story. It was anticlimactic, and how did you even know anything was actually there? Maybe it was just another animal going by. And you know what? You're entirely right. But the adrenaline we got from the fear of the unknown that night is probably what saved us in the first place. Yosemite Nearly Ended Me by Anana Possum. I'd always dreamed of hiking in Yosemite National Park. The vast wilderness, stunning landscapes, and the chance to escape the hustle and bustle of city life were what drew me to the great outdoors in the first place. But what I experienced was far beyond what I could have ever imagined. Walking through the forest, I realized I had lost the trail. The trees were so thick and tall that they blocked out the sun, and the dense undergrowth made it nearly impossible to see more than a few feet in front of me. I tried to retrace my steps, but every tree looked the same, and I found myself wandering through the woods. As the sun began to set, panic set in. I was lost and alone and had no idea how to return to civilization. I tried to use my phone, but of course there was no freaking signal. I had no food or water left, and my legs were aching from all the walking. When I thought things couldn't get any freaking worse, I tripped over a rock hard, hitting my head. When I came to, it was dark and the forest was eerily silent. I tried to stand up, but my legs gave out beneath me. I was injured, lost, and completely alone. Fear completely consumed me. I was gripped by anxiety, and I began to hear strange noises in the distance. Now, I can't tell you for the life of me if this was because of my head injury, and it likely was, but I felt like something was out there, watching me, waiting for me. As the night wore on, my injuries began to worsen. I could feel my body shutting down, and my mind was playing tricks on me. Every rustle of leaves, snap of a twig, seemed like it was something coming to get me, some sort of sinister monster just waiting to eat me. And then I saw it. Again, I can't tell you if it was real or not. It was a dark figure lurking just beyond the trees. It was humanoid but distorted, with long, spindly limbs and glowing eyes. It seemed to be watching me, waiting for me to make a move. I tried to crawl away, but again my body was far too weak. My head was pounding. Dried blood had made it hard for me to fully open my eyelids. This figure began approaching me. I knew that this would probably be my end if it was not a hallucination. I closed my eyes and waited for my end to come, but when I opened my eyes again, the figure was gone, and the forest was bathed in an eerie light. The following day, I was found by a park ranger barely clinging to life. I had been missing for 2 days. My injuries were severe. I was rushed to the hospital where I spent several weeks recovering from my ordeal. This is something that is real life. Getting lost in the woods is very dangerous, my friends. So please, don't ever go off trail. Even if you see something cool that you want to photograph, even just for a second. Especially if you're alone. I learned my lesson the hard way, and I still to this day have some long-lasting effects from that head injury. Sometimes I still see those images, and I know they're not real. At least I hope they're not.